What if the most influential figure in the world suddenly faced his final hour? What if, in that moment, even the richest person alive stood silent? It was a question that echoed across newsrooms, social media feeds, and living rooms around the world. It wasn't the kind of question you could easily shake off, the kind of question that demanded reflection, not just on the state of the world, but on the legacy of a man who had become a symbol of something much larger than himself. The Pope, Pope Francis, was nearing the end of his life. It was a fact that the world was beginning to confront with growing uncertainty, but it was a truth few were ready to accept. The announcement had come quietly at first. A statement from the Vatican, brief and to the point: His Holiness Pope Francis is seriously ill. The Holy Father requests the faithful to pray for him. Those words alone were enough to send waves of shock through the global community. As news spread, the usual hustle of headlines and debates about the Pope's influence began to shift. This was no longer about his policies, his stance on climate change, or his calls for peace. This was about the possibility of losing the very symbol of compassion and hope for millions. The world had been watching Pope Francis closely in the years leading up to this moment. His papacy had been marked by remarkable humility, a rejection of luxury, and a deep commitment to the poor and marginalized. He'd embraced the modern world, never afraid to tackle issues like climate change, income inequality, and the moral challenges posed by rapid technological advancement. He was a man who had constantly championed the values of peace, forgiveness, and global unity. But now, it seemed as though his time was running out. The world had to come to terms with something that seemed unfathomable: the man who had captured hearts from every corner of the globe was fading. And in the silence that followed, something strange began to happen. Across the globe, leaders and citizens, religious figures and the tech elite, all of them who had once disagreed, even clashed with one another, now stood united in their anticipation. There was something about Pope Francis passing that caused a rare moment of global pause, a rare moment of introspection. Even the most powerful and opinionated figures in the world were contemplating a simple truth: what happens when the voice that has inspired millions, even shaped the moral compass of entire nations, can no longer speak? Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur known for his ambitious projects that spanned from electric cars to space exploration, was one of those figures who couldn't ignore the significance of the Pope's imminent passing. Musk, who had long prided himself on being a man of science and innovation, found himself perplexed by a question he couldn't answer: what would the world look like without a guiding moral figure like the Pope? He'd made no secret of his skepticism toward religion, dismissing it at times as an outdated system in the face of the rapid advancements he was championing. But even Musk couldn't escape the fact that Pope Francis' influence had transcended faith. It had become a moral compass for a society struggling with inequality, climate change, and the seemingly unchecked power of technology. The world watched as Musk and other tech moguls began to tweet about the Pope's health. There was a certain reverence in their words that hadn't been there before. As if, in the shadow of death, they too were searching for something beyond the realms of Silicon Valley innovation. In a particularly poignant moment, Musk shared a tweet: "The Pope's message of peace has been one of the few constant truths in an ever-changing world. Let us all take a moment to reflect on that." It was a rare sentiment from a man who had made billions by disrupting industries, questioning norms, and challenging the status quo. But as he typed those words, the quiet reflection wasn't just about Pope Francis, it was about something deeper, a profound realization that perhaps the future he was helping build needed to be anchored by more than just technology. In that moment, something remarkable happened. Musk's millions of followers, who often engaged with him in debates about artificial intelligence, space travel, and the future of humanity, began to comment on the tweet in a way that was unlike any conversation he had sparked before. People weren't talking about innovation. They were talking about legacy, humanity, and hope. There was a sense of unity that transcended borders and belief systems, a moment where even the most vocal tech advocates were forced to confront the question of what it meant to be human in the face of loss. But it wasn't just Musk's followers who were engaging. The world, from Hollywood celebrities to grassroots activists, had found a common thread in the Pope's life. They began to reflect on the Pope's message, on his willingness to live humbly, on his advocacy for climate action, on his calls to build a world that embraced all people, no matter their race, creed, or social standing. The question on everyone's mind was no longer about the man, but about his impact. His absence would create a void, one that could not be filled by technology or wealth. "Where do we go from here?" one person commented on a viral post. It was the question everyone was silently asking themselves, even if they didn't have the words for it. As the world collectively held its breath, the Pope's health deteriorated further, and his last days became an event that transcended the walls of the Vatican. News outlets from all over the world, from Paris to Tokyo, from New York to Nairobi, carried updates. The Pope's death wasn't just a religious event, it was a global moment, a moment of reflection for humanity. And then, the unexpected happened. In an unprecedented move, the Pope's doctors allowed a live broadcast of his final moments. As cameras positioned themselves in the quiet corridors of the Vatican, the world tuned in. What had once seemed like an impossible event, a moment that could challenge even the most stoic hearts, became a point of connection. The entire world, regardless of their beliefs, watched in silence, waiting to witness the final chapter of a man who had shown them the power of love, humility, and faith. It was in this moment of quiet reverence that the world realized something undeniable: Pope Francis was not just the leader of the Catholic Church. He was a voice of reason, a moral anchor in a rapidly changing world. As the clock ticked down, the question echoed once more: what would happen if the most influential figure in the world was no longer there to guide us? And for the first time, even Elon Musk, the man who had always prided himself on challenging norms, found himself without an answer. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Pope Francis was more than just a religious leader, he was a symbol of hope, humility, and compassion in a world that often seemed to lack all three. His papacy had been nothing short of transformative, not just within the confines of the Catholic Church, but across the global stage. To truly understand the weight of his absence, one had to look back at the life he had built, not the papal robes or the Vatican walls, but the journey that had led him to become the figure revered by millions. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Pope Francis' rise to the papacy was anything but typical. He wasn't born into royalty, nor was he a man of great wealth or influence. His story began in the humble streets of a working-class neighborhood, where his parents, Italian immigrants, struggled to make ends meet. His early life was filled with hardships, but it was also filled with the values that would later define his papacy: love for others, compassion for the poor, and a deep sense of humility. In his younger years, Francis was a man of action. He studied chemistry and worked in a variety of jobs before deciding to pursue a life of religious service. But it wasn't an easy path. Francis faced many struggles within the church, opposition, personal doubts, and moments of isolation, but through it all, his commitment to his faith and his belief in the transformative power of love kept him grounded. When he became the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, his legacy as a man of the people truly began to take shape. Unlike many high-ranking religious figures, Francis did not live in the grand palaces typically afforded to church leaders. Instead, he lived in a simple apartment, took public transportation, and spent his days ministering to the poor and the marginalized. His actions spoke louder than words. He didn't just preach about the importance of social justice, he lived it. His approach to leadership was both radical and refreshingly simple. He believed in the power of community, in the idea that the church should be a place where all people could come together, regardless of their background or their station in life. Whether it was his calls for economic equality, his stance on climate change, or his tireless advocacy for refugees, Pope Francis was never one to shy away from difficult issues. He spoke truth to power, and his words resonated with a wide spectrum of people, from the devout to the secular. But perhaps his most defining trait was his deep sense of empathy. He had the rare ability to connect with people from all walks of life, whether it was a homeless person on the streets of Rome or a world leader in a formal summit. He had the uncanny ability to make others feel heard, seen, and understood. And in a world that often felt divided, this was a gift that many had come to treasure. Yet, despite the universal admiration he garnered, Pope Francis never sought the limelight. He was a man of deep introspection and quiet humility, often shying away from the spotlight that naturally followed him wherever he went. His focus was always on others, on lifting up the oppressed, speaking out against injustice, and showing the world that faith was not just about rituals, but about living out the values of love, kindness, and mercy. As Pope Francis' health began to decline, the global community began to reflect on what his absence would mean. It was hard for many to imagine a world without him, without his calming presence and his unwavering moral compass. His messages had reached the farthest corners of the earth, from small villages in Africa to the bustling cities of the Western world. He had become a voice for those who had none, and a reminder to all that the most important things in life were not wealth, power, or success, but love, faith, and compassion. In his later years, Pope Francis began to speak more openly about his own mortality. He knew his time was short, and he used his final years to continue his mission of peace, urging the world to embrace the values he had always preached. His messages became more poignant, more urgent. He warned of the dangers of division, of the growing gap between the rich and the poor, and of the environmental destruction that threatened the very future of humanity. But he never lost hope. His faith in humanity, in the goodness of people, remained unshaken. For many, Pope Francis was the embodiment of everything the world needed in that moment, a leader who refused to be swayed by the pressures of politics or public opinion, a leader who put people before power, and a leader who understood that true greatness came not from wealth or status, but from the ability to love and serve others. As the news of his illness spread, people began to reflect not just on his work, but on what it had meant to have him in the world. What had his papacy represented? What would the world be like without him? For some, the Pope had been a source of hope during difficult times. His words had inspired countless individuals to dedicate themselves to causes larger than themselves, to stand up against injustice, and to live more selflessly. For others, he had been a moral beacon in a world that often seemed lost, a reminder that love and compassion still mattered, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. But above all, Pope Francis had taught the world that true power lay not in dominance, but in the ability to connect with others, to show kindness, and to work together for the common good. It was a message that transcended religion, politics, and culture, a message that, even in his final days, continued to resonate. As the days passed, the question that had first been posed, what if the most influential figure in the world suddenly faced his final hour, began to feel more and more like a reality. The world wasn't just losing a pope, it was losing a voice of reason, a champion of the marginalized, and a symbol of hope in a world that desperately needed it. And with each passing day, the world stood still, awaiting the inevitable conclusion to a chapter that had begun with a young man's humble dedication to faith and had grown into a global movement for love, peace, and justice. The tension was palpable across the globe. In every corner of the world, people had come to grips with the reality that Pope Francis, the figure who had served as a moral compass for millions, was in his final days. Yet, in the midst of grief and reflection, something extraordinary began to unfold. Pope Francis had always preached about the importance of community, the power of coming together to create change. And as the world waited, people from all walks of life began to come together, drawn by the same question that had haunted them from the moment they first heard the news: what happens now? It was as if the world had reached a tipping point. The fast pace of modern life, the constant drive for progress, and the relentless pursuit of material success had created a world that often felt disconnected, fragmented, and fractured. In a time when technology was rapidly advancing, and political and social divisions seemed to widen by the day, Pope Francis had served as a steadying force, a reminder that humanity's true strength lay not in power or wealth, but in compassion, empathy, and unity. But what would happen if that guiding voice were suddenly silenced? As the Pope's health continued to decline, the world was faced with an existential question: what kind of world would we live in without him? It was a question that loomed large over every conversation, every media headline, and every moment of reflection. Even the most cynical voices, those who had long dismissed the role of religion in shaping the world, found themselves pondering the deeper meaning of Pope Francis' influence. In the United States, leaders from both sides of the political spectrum, who often found themselves at odds, began to speak in unison. They acknowledged the profound impact Pope Francis had had on global issues such as climate change, social justice, and human rights. President John Harris, a Republican who had often publicly disagreed with the Pope's calls for social reform, made an uncharacteristically heartfelt statement. Pope Francis may not have agreed with every policy we championed, but his commitment to the well-being of the poor, his insistence that we care for the planet, and his message of peace transcended politics. We may not always agree with his approach, but there's no denying the power of his message. His legacy will endure, regardless of who sits in the Oval Office. It wasn't just political figures who were taking note. The global business community, often more concerned with profits and growth than moral leadership, found itself grappling with the Pope's legacy. In boardrooms and company headquarters across the world, leaders began to reflect on the impact of his words, particularly when it came to issues like income inequality and the environment. Elon Musk, the tech mogul whose innovations had redefined entire industries, tweeted again. Pope Francis' message of hope and responsibility has been one of the few constants in an unpredictable world. As we push forward with innovation, we must remember that our progress must serve humanity, not just our wallets. It was a tweet that caught the attention of thousands, sparking a wave of discussions that reached beyond the usual confines of business and technology circles. People were starting to realize that perhaps the answers they sought, to the pressing issues of our time, lay not just in the hands of politicians or business leaders, but in the collective will of humanity. Across the globe, from the streets of New York to the markets of Nairobi, people began to take part in a movement of reflection and action. In some cities, people gathered in public spaces to hold vigils for the Pope, lighting candles and praying together. In others, activists organized protests, not out of anger, but in honor of the Pope's call for a more just and compassionate world. But what struck most observers was the tone of these gatherings. They were not just acts of mourning, but moments of unity. People who had never met before, who came from different cultures, religions, and backgrounds, stood together, sharing their hopes for a better world. It was as if the Pope's impending death had brought people to a place of deep introspection, where the boundaries that usually divided them no longer seemed so important. As the world seemed to inch closer to the Pope's final moments, many began to acknowledge something profound. The Pope's influence wasn't just about the work he had done in his lifetime, but about the way he had inspired a movement that could transcend his own death. His message had planted seeds of change, and now it was up to the rest of the world to carry that torch forward. For those who had followed his papacy, it became clear that the real challenge was not just about honoring his legacy in the short term, but about building a future that aligned with the values he had championed. Pope Francis had not simply been a figurehead of the Catholic Church, he had been a global leader, an advocate for humanity's collective soul. And now, in the final days of his life, it was up to the rest of the world to rise to the occasion. In the Vatican, the final preparations were underway. A sense of solemnity hung in the air as the cardinals gathered, waiting for the inevitable. But there was also a sense of hope. As much as the world grieved the loss of Pope Francis, there was an understanding that his teachings would live on, not just through the Church, but through the hearts and minds of those who had been touched by his message. And as Pope Francis' final moments drew near, people everywhere were forced to confront the same question once more: what will the world look like when we no longer have his guidance? It was a question that didn't have a clear answer. But what was certain was that the Pope had left behind a profound legacy, one that had changed the world and would continue to influence generations to come. Whether the world would rise to meet that challenge, however, remained uncertain. As the days stretched on, the world held its collective breath. Pope Francis' health continued to deteriorate, and the Vatican's official reports became more solemn with each passing hour. The sense of inevitability hung heavy in the air, a silent weight that pressed down on every person who had ever been touched by the Pope's words and actions. The figure of Pope Francis, a man who had lived a life of radical humility and selfless service, was preparing for the final chapter of his story. In the Vatican, the scene was both serene and intense. The corridors were quieter than usual, the air filled with a sense of reverence that extended far beyond the church walls. Cardinals, priests, and lay people alike had gathered, awaiting the final moments of a man who had redefined the role of the papacy. His contributions to the church were undeniable, reforming its approach to social issues, advocating for environmental justice, and reaching out to those marginalized by society. But it was not just his work that had captured hearts, it was his humanity, his refusal to sit in judgment, and his deep empathy for all people. The day that Pope Francis' passing seemed inevitable, the world began to wake up to a sudden surge of attention, not just for the Pope himself, but for the very values he embodied. News outlets from around the globe carried live reports, tracking his condition and reflecting on his legacy. Social media exploded with tributes, and people from all walks of life took to their devices, sharing memories, recounting moments of inspiration, and commenting on the global influence he had brought into their lives. But among the sadness, something remarkable was unfolding. It was not just an outpouring of grief. The world was beginning to ask itself a deeper question: what would we do now? Pope Francis had always spoken about the world's need to change its ways, to focus less on personal gain and more on collective responsibility. His vision for the future had always extended beyond the church. It was a vision of global unity, cooperation, and mutual respect. And now, as the world faced the loss of this towering figure, people began to feel a greater sense of urgency. The first signs of this shift came from unexpected places. In Silicon Valley, normally dominated by individualism and competition, business leaders who had long placed profits above social responsibility began rethinking their priorities. Elon Musk, whose previous words had hinted at a deep admiration for the Pope's message of responsibility, took to Twitter once more. Pope Francis wasn't just the leader of the Catholic Church, he was the moral compass for our entire generation. Now, we face a crucial moment. The next steps we take for our planet, for our people, must be guided by the principles he taught us. It's up to us to continue his work. In Paris, an international climate summit that had been scheduled for weeks began to take on a new tone. Leaders gathered around the table, their discussions shifting to reflect not only the urgency of the climate crisis but also the legacy of the Pope's tireless advocacy for the environment. For once, there was consensus: the world could no longer afford to delay action. Pope Francis had spoken about the dangers of environmental degradation in his encyclical Laudato Si', but now, in the shadow of his passing, world leaders felt the weight of his words in a more profound way. They began to see his call for climate action not just as a moral imperative, but as an existential one. The ripple effects didn't stop there. Across Africa, in nations where poverty and social unrest had long been entrenched, grassroots movements began to intensify. Activists who had been inspired by Pope Francis' messages of justice and equality saw his death as a moment of reckoning. They were determined to honor his legacy by redoubling their efforts to address economic disparity and ensure that the poor were given a voice in the political process. In the United States, the public discourse began to shift as well. With political polarization at an all-time high, many Americans who had been divided on issues of wealth, healthcare, and immigration began to find common ground. For the first time in years, people from across the political spectrum stood together to acknowledge Pope Francis' teachings. It was as though his life had brought people to a moment of clarity: we were all in this together. The values he espoused, grounded in love, peace, and social justice, seemed more relevant than ever. Meanwhile, inside the walls of the Vatican, those closest to the Pope continued their vigil. The papal doctors had already informed the cardinals and bishops that the end was near. The Pope, now frail and exhausted, had barely spoken for days, but his presence was still undeniable. There was a quiet dignity about him, even in his final hours, the same calm demeanor he had shown throughout his papacy, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. As evening fell on the Vatican, Cardinal Giovanni Vescari, a close confidant of the Pope, sat at his bedside. The atmosphere was one of sacred reverence, as if the very walls of the room held the wisdom of a lifetime of service. With each breath the Pope took, there was a sense of peace that enveloped everyone present, a recognition that this was the end of an era, but also the beginning of something that would forever carry the mark of his work. Outside, the crowds gathered. They had come to the Vatican from all corners of the world, drawn not only by the gravity of the Pope's final hours but by a sense of solidarity. Their collective grief was palpable, but so was their shared resolve. People sang hymns, lit candles, and quietly prayed, hoping that the Pope's passing would not be the end of his message but the spark for something larger. And then, at approximately 9 p.m. Rome time, the Pope's life came to a peaceful close. The news spread quickly. It wasn't just Catholics who mourned the loss of Pope Francis, it was the entire world. But even in death, Pope Francis managed to do what he had done best: he brought people together. In his passing, the world was forced to confront the profound impact he had made and the questions that now loomed over the future. What now? His death was a tipping point, but not just in the sense of marking the end of an era. It was a moment that left the world with a choice: to honor his legacy by carrying forward the values he espoused, or to let his message fade into the past. The world would soon discover which path it would choose. The death of Pope Francis sent shockwaves across the globe. It was as if the world paused for a moment, caught in the collective breath of disbelief, sorrow, and reflection. His passing had been anticipated, but the reality of it left a profound emptiness that many had not prepared for. For those who had known him, admired him, or been touched by his work, this was not just the loss of a religious leader, it was the loss of a voice of reason, a symbol of hope, and a beacon of compassion in an increasingly turbulent world. The first moments following the news were marked by an outpouring of grief. The Vatican, normally a place of solemn rituals and prayers, became a hub of activity. Crowds of mourners gathered outside, clutching candles, flowers, and pictures of the Pope, while the world's leaders began to respond. Flags around the world were lowered to half-mast, and many nations declared periods of national mourning. President Harris, who had once expressed his admiration for the Pope, was one of the first to speak. Standing in front of the White House, his voice filled with emotion, he said, "The world has lost a giant." Pope Francis was not just the spiritual leader of millions, he was a champion of the poor, an advocate for the planet, and a voice of peace in a divided world. His teachings transcended religion and reached the hearts of people from all walks of life. It is now our responsibility to carry his message forward. We must honor his legacy, not just in words, but through action. The reaction from other world leaders was similarly poignant. In Brazil, where Pope Francis had enjoyed widespread admiration, President Luís Mendes made a public statement from Rio de Janeiro. Pope Francis was not only a moral leader, he was a revolutionary. His call for justice, his passion for the environment, and his commitment to the poor have inspired us all. Today, we mourn the loss of a great man, but we also reaffirm our commitment to his vision for a better world. As the days passed, tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Political leaders, celebrities, activists, and even those who had never shared the Pope's religious beliefs expressed their deep sorrow and admiration. Social media was flooded with messages, photos, and videos highlighting the Pope's impact, not just as a religious figure, but as a symbol of decency in a world increasingly starved for integrity. The United Nations held a moment of silence to honor Pope Francis, and a special session was convened to discuss his legacy. Secretary-General Marie Clark spoke with deep reverence. Pope Francis understood that the world's greatest challenges were not isolated problems, but interconnected crises that could only be solved by global cooperation. He called for compassion in the face of adversity and advocated tirelessly for those who had been left behind. His death is not the end of his mission. It is the beginning of the responsibility each of us now carries to continue the work he started. But beyond the political and diplomatic responses, the most striking reaction came from the people. In cities all over the world, from the slums of Dhaka to the streets of Paris, people who had never met Pope Francis gathered in solidarity, forming vigil lines that stretched for miles. Their grief was palpable, but there was also a sense of resolve, a recognition that Pope Francis had given them something invaluable, something they could carry forward. In Argentina, where the Pope had been born, the response was particularly emotional. Thousands of people gathered in Buenos Aires to celebrate his life and to mourn his passing. Flags flew at half-mast, and churches were filled with prayer and remembrance. For many, Pope Francis had been a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, compassion and love could light the way. What was perhaps most remarkable about these gatherings was the diversity of those who showed up. In New York, a group of refugees from Syria, many of whom had found safety in the U.S. thanks to the Pope's calls for compassion toward displaced peoples, gathered together outside St. Patrick's Cathedral. They held signs that read, "Gracias, Papa Francisco," and "We carry your message in our hearts." The unity across cultures, religions, and nationalities was a testament to the Pope's ability to transcend boundaries. Pope Francis had often spoken about the need to build bridges, not walls, to find common ground where others saw division. Now, in the wake of his death, it seemed as though the world was listening. In the midst of the global mourning, however, a troubling question began to rise to the surface: what happens now? As the outpouring of grief continued, many began to wonder whether the world would honor Pope Francis' legacy or fall back into its old ways. Would his death mark the beginning of real change, or would it simply be another passing moment of sorrow that soon faded into the background? In the days following his death, a sense of urgency began to emerge. It was as if the world knew that this moment, this collective grief, was an opportunity to reflect on the Pope's teachings and, more importantly, to act on them. The question that everyone was asking was whether the world would rise to meet the challenge he had laid out. Would humanity find the courage to follow through on the moral imperative he had made so clear? There were signs of hope. In the wake of Pope Francis' death, grassroots organizations dedicated to climate change, poverty alleviation, and social justice saw an uptick in support. Donations poured in, and new volunteers signed up to take part in initiatives aimed at creating lasting change. Activists, inspired by the Pope's tireless dedication to these causes, began organizing with renewed vigor, hoping to channel the grief and reflection into tangible action. Yet, there was still a sense of uncertainty. As the media coverage of Pope Francis began to fade from the headlines, many wondered how long the momentum for change would last. The political challenges of the world were as formidable as ever, and the economic systems that had driven inequality for centuries remained largely unchanged. The Pope had called for a radical transformation, but would the world be willing to answer? In the Vatican, the process of selecting a new pope began. The conclave of cardinals would soon gather to choose a successor, and the world awaited the outcome. The selection of the next pope would be a momentous decision, one that could determine whether the Catholic Church, and the world, would continue on the path of transformation that Pope Francis had set in motion, or whether it would revert to a more traditional, conservative approach. As the world waited for what would come next, one thing was clear: Pope Francis' death had sparked a global conversation. And the world, for better or worse, would never be the same again. The death of Pope Francis had left a monumental void, not only in the hearts of millions but also within the structure of the Catholic Church itself. As the world mourned, the Vatican began the delicate and secretive process of selecting a new pontiff. The conclave of cardinals, those entrusted with the weighty responsibility of choosing the next leader of the Roman Catholic Church, was set to convene in the coming days. The outcome of their decision would determine the future direction of the Church and, potentially, the direction of the world itself. The Vatican, though steeped in centuries of tradition, was not immune to the forces of change that Pope Francis had championed. His papacy had been a radical departure from the norm, a pontiff who chose humility over grandeur, social justice over institutional conservatism, and compassion over rigid orthodoxy. The question now on everyone's mind was whether the next pope would continue in his footsteps or whether the Church would revert to its more traditional ways. The cardinals who would gather for the conclave were men of considerable influence and power, each with their own vision for the future of the Church. Some were seen as progressive, advocating for reforms that mirrored Pope Francis' ideas on environmental stewardship, poverty alleviation, and social justice. Others were more conservative, seeking to preserve the doctrines and traditions of the Church as they had existed for centuries. But in the wake of Pope Francis' death, the world was watching closely, hoping for a leader who would rise above the politics of the Vatican and address the larger global issues that had become increasingly central to the papacy. Cardinal Giovanni Vescovi, one of the most prominent voices within the Church, was among those most deeply affected by Pope Francis' passing. Having served as a close advisor to the Pope, Vescovi knew the weight of responsibility that lay ahead. He had often been in the Pope's inner circle, discussing not just the affairs of the Church, but also the broader issues that defined the Pope's legacy. The question that weighed heavily on him, however, was how the Church would react to the shifting tides of global politics, especially in light of the Pope's recent calls for greater inclusivity and compassion for marginalized communities. Vescovi wasn't the only one feeling the pressure. In the weeks following Pope Francis' death, whispers began to circulate about potential candidates. The speculation was feverish, with names like Cardinal Matteo Bianchi, a moderate who had served in the Vatican's diplomatic corps, and Cardinal Rosa Maria Gonzalez, a prominent Latin American prelate known for her work with the poor, rising to the forefront. The conclave itself was a spectacle of secrecy, tradition, and spirituality. Cardinals, cloaked in red robes, filed into the Sistine Chapel, the majestic frescoes overhead casting a reverent glow over the proceedings. It was here, in this sacred space, that the future of the Church would be determined. The world's eyes were fixed on the event, though the decision-making process would remain hidden behind the chapel's closed doors, known only to those who had taken the oath of silence. Outside, the atmosphere in Rome was electric. Crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square, their faces filled with anticipation and hope. They waited for the fateful white smoke to rise from the chimney, signaling that a new pope had been chosen. In the days leading up to the conclave, the discussions were wide-ranging. People talked not just about theology but about the pope's legacy, what kind of leadership the world needed, and how the next pontiff could continue the work of a man who had redefined the papacy in many ways. Meanwhile, in the halls of the Vatican, the cardinals knew that their task was more than just a religious one, it was a political one, too. The Church was at a crossroads, and their choice would have far-reaching consequences beyond the walls of the Vatican. Pope Francis had set a new course, one that had sometimes clashed with the traditionalist elements within the Church. But it had also inspired millions, especially the younger generations, who saw in him a champion of social justice and environmental responsibility. Cardinal Vescovi, whose moderate stance had often made him a bridge between the progressive and conservative factions of the Church, knew the stakes were higher than ever. The world was waiting for a pope who could unite the faithful, continue the work of reform, and, perhaps most importantly, carry the message of hope that Pope Francis had so powerfully conveyed during his papacy. As the conclave began, the cardinals took their seats in the Sistine Chapel, the heavy doors closing behind them. In the silence of the chapel, the weight of history seemed to settle over them. The decision they were about to make was one that would affect not only the Church but the world at large. Their prayer was simple, but profound, to be guided by the Holy Spirit in selecting a leader who could lead the Church through a time of great challenge and change. Inside the chapel, the process of voting began. Each cardinal would write down the name of his chosen candidate on a ballot and place it into a large urn. After all votes had been cast, the ballots would be counted, and the results announced. If no candidate received the necessary two-thirds majority, the voting would continue until a new pope was chosen. Outside, the world waited with bated breath. News outlets covered every aspect of the conclave, from the whispered rumors about who might emerge as the new pope to the more personal stories about the cardinals themselves. But amid all the speculation, one thing remained clear: Pope Francis' death had sparked a global conversation about the future of the Church and the world. The world was not merely looking for a new pope, it was looking for a leader who could meet the challenges of the 21st century, a leader who could embody the values of love, justice, and compassion that Pope Francis had championed. As the voting continued, tensions ran high. The Vatican remained a place of quiet contemplation, but outside, in the square, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. The world was on the edge of a new era, and the choice made within the Sistine Chapel would decide the course of history. Then, after several rounds of voting, the moment arrived. The bell in St. Peter's Square rang, signaling the end of the conclave and the announcement of the new pope. The crowd fell silent, their collective breath held in anticipation. White smoke rose from the chimney. The new pope had been chosen. The white smoke billowed from the chimney atop the Sistine Chapel, drifting high into the crisp Roman sky. The world had been waiting for this moment, a moment that would mark the beginning of a new era for the Catholic Church, a new chapter in a story that had spanned centuries. The waiting crowd in St. Peter's Square erupted into a wave of emotion, some in tears, others in cheers, all with a sense of anticipation that could only be described as palpable. A new pope had been chosen. Pope Francisco II. The name echoed through the square as the Vatican spokesperson, Cardinal Giovanni Vescovi, appeared at the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica. His eyes were somber but filled with the gravity of the moment. He raised his hands, signaling for silence before speaking the words that would resonate throughout the world. I announce to you the election of a new pontiff, His Holiness Pope Francisco II. The name took a moment to settle in. While the world had speculated and hoped for continuity in leadership, the decision to name the new pope, Francisco II, spoke volumes. It was a sign that the Church had decided, with resolve, to continue the spirit of Pope Francis' reforms, yet it also carried with it an unspoken promise that the new pope would forge his own path, one that would honor the legacy of his predecessor, but not be confined by it. The cheers from the crowd were deafening. The choice of Pope Francisco II was a testament to the progressive currents that had shaped the past decade of the papacy. The decision made by the cardinals, one that seemed to confirm the hope that the Church would continue down the path of social justice, inclusivity, and global responsibility, was met with relief. But there was also an undercurrent of uncertainty. The Church was a massive, centuries-old institution, and the question of whether the new pope would maintain the momentum of Pope Francis or take a different direction remained unanswered. Inside the Vatican, Cardinal Vescovi could not help but reflect on the weight of his own role in this moment. For years, he had worked closely with Pope Francis, and now, as the man tasked with communicating this monumental decision to the world, he felt the full burden of history on his shoulders. He had known Francisco II personally, and though their paths had not always aligned perfectly, there was a deep respect between them. The new pope was a man of integrity, with a deep commitment to both the teachings of the Church and the social issues that Pope Francis had made central to his papacy. Francisco II was not a newcomer to the Vatican. Born Matteo Bianchi, he had served as the Archbishop of Milan and had worked closely with Pope Francis on several key initiatives, particularly those involving the intersection of faith and global social justice. Bianchi was known for his quiet demeanor, sharp intellect, and his ability to navigate the complex worlds of both the Vatican and global diplomacy. His background in both theology and economics made him a well-rounded candidate to confront the challenges that lay ahead. But Francisco II was also a man of action. Unlike his predecessor, who had often spoken in poetic terms about change, Francisco II was known for his willingness to roll up his sleeves and get things done. His tenure as Archbishop of Milan had been marked by a series of practical initiatives to address poverty, immigration, and climate change. His focus on grassroots engagement with marginalized communities and his efforts to modernize the Church's approach to contemporary social issues made him a figure of hope for many, especially the younger generations who had grown disillusioned with the Church's past resistance to change. The world was now waiting to see how Francisco II would handle the weight of the papacy. His first address to the faithful would be critical, not just in terms of his message, but also in terms of how he presented himself to the world. Would he continue the populist tone set by Pope Francis? Would he emphasize a vision of unity and progress, or would he focus more on the spiritual renewal of the Church? When Francisco II finally appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, there was a moment of awe in the square. The sun, now dipping toward the horizon, bathed the ancient stones of the Vatican in golden light. The new pope stood before the masses, his face calm and reflective. He was not a man of great theatrics, and yet there was an undeniable gravitas to his presence. The crowd fell into a hushed silence, waiting for his first words. He began softly, almost in a whisper. Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, it is with a humble heart and a spirit full of gratitude that I accept the responsibility you have entrusted to me today. I stand before you, not as a man of power, but as a servant of the people. The world is changing, and with it, the Church must change too. We must be the light that guides those who walk in darkness, the hope for those who have none, and the hands that lift up the broken-hearted. His words, though simple, carried a weight that seemed to settle on the crowd like a warm blanket. Pope Francisco too was not here to be a charismatic figurehead, he was here to lead, to guide, and to bring the Church into a new era. But let us not forget, he continued, that change does not come easily, and it does not come without sacrifice. We must be willing to stand together, to bridge the divides that separate us, and to act with love and compassion toward all. I promise you, I will walk this journey with you. Together, we will face the challenges of our time, poverty, inequality, climate change, and the fragmentation of our world. And together, we will find the strength to overcome them. As he spoke, there was a palpable sense of hope that filled St. Peter's Square. The crowd, which had been filled with anxiety in the days leading up to the conclave, now seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Francisco too had not only pledged to continue the work of Pope Francis, he had promised to make the journey alongside the people. He was not an outsider looking down on the faithful from a distant pulpit, he was one of them, walking side by side as they faced the challenges ahead. As the address concluded, the crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the square. There was a sense of unity, not just among the faithful, but among the many who had gathered, hoping that this new pope would provide the moral leadership the world so desperately needed. Yet, even as the applause echoed through the square, there was a lingering question: could Francisco too live up to the promise of his words? Could he truly lead the Church into a new era, one that embraced change while remaining grounded in the timeless teachings of Christ? The world would soon find out. But for now, there was hope. And that, in itself, was a powerful thing. Pope Francisco II's first days as the leader of the Catholic Church were filled with both promise and pressure. As he settled into his new role, the world watched closely, waiting for signs of how he would navigate the complex landscape of the Vatican, the Church's global influence, and the mounting crises facing the world. The first major test came sooner than anyone had anticipated. The international community had been facing a growing refugee crisis, one that had escalated in recent months due to ongoing conflicts in the Middle East and Africa. Thousands of families were fleeing war-torn countries, seeking safety in Europe and beyond. As the new pope, Francisco too would be forced to address this humanitarian catastrophe. The question was, how would he respond? Pope Francis had famously advocated for compassion toward refugees, urging Europe and other developed nations to open their doors. But the situation had only grown more dire under Francisco II's papacy. Countries were increasingly turning away refugees, citing security concerns, economic strain, and the fear of destabilizing their social systems. The new pope had already expressed his commitment to social justice, but this was his first opportunity to take a strong public stance on one of the most urgent issues facing the world. As the media coverage of the crisis intensified, Pope Francisco too began to prepare for his first major public address on the matter. He understood the significance of the moment. His words would either galvanize the faithful and the wider world or risk alienating them. He had already received counsel from his advisors, some of whom urged caution, fearing that a too forceful approach might antagonize powerful governments. Others, however, saw this as a defining moment, one that could either confirm his commitment to the values of justice and compassion or suggest that his papacy would be more about diplomacy than action. The Pope's decision was a reflection of the deep personal convictions he had held long before he assumed the papacy. As Archbishop of Milan, he had been known for his hands-on approach to helping refugees, providing them with food, shelter, and medical care. His personal experience with displaced families was extensive. Having worked in both impoverished neighborhoods and high-level diplomatic circles, Francisco too understood the complexity of the issue but believed that the Church's response had to be unequivocal and rooted in compassion. On the day of his address, the atmosphere in the Vatican was tense. Cardinals, officials, and members of the press gathered in the Vatican's main auditorium, awaiting the new pope's words. There was a sense of both expectation and uncertainty. No one knew exactly how the new pope would handle the situation, but everyone understood that this would set the tone for his leadership. The pope entered the room with a quiet but determined demeanor. His first words were not just a greeting but an invitation to reflect on the gravity of the moment. Brothers and sisters in Christ, today we are faced with a crisis unlike any we have known before. Men, women, and children are fleeing violence, persecution, and war. They are looking for a place of safety, for a chance to build new lives. They are our brothers and sisters. They are children of God, and we, as a church, must answer their cry. The room was silent as he spoke. His voice was steady, his words measured, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his tone. He continued. The challenge before us is not just a political or economic one, it is a moral one. Our faith calls us to love our neighbors, to welcome the stranger, to feed the hungry, and to clothe the naked. This is not a matter of charity, it is a matter of justice. The Pope paused, allowing his words to sink in. The room was still. He knew that this speech would spark strong reactions, both positive and negative. But for him, there was no turning back. His conscience was clear, and he believed that the Church's mission was to act as a moral compass, particularly when the world seemed to lose its way. We cannot remain silent while people suffer. We cannot turn our backs on those in need. The Church will stand with the refugees. We will advocate for them, support them, and help them rebuild their lives. Our faith is not just for Sunday mornings, it must be present every day, in every corner of the world. There was a pause before the Pope concluded with a call to action. I call on all nations, all peoples, to open their hearts. To embrace the stranger, to show compassion, and to remember that we are all God's children, bound together by a common humanity. The Church will do its part, but we need the help of all to make this world a place where no one is left behind. The Pope's words resonated beyond the walls of the Vatican. His speech was broadcast live across the globe, and within hours, it became clear that the world was paying attention. The response was immediate and intense. Humanitarian organizations applauded his stance, praising the Pope for speaking out at a time when so many political leaders were choosing to remain silent or to take an adversarial stance against refugees. However, not everyone was pleased with the Pope's message. Leaders in several European countries, particularly those who had been vocal about restricting immigration, expressed frustration at what they saw as an intrusion of the Church into political matters. Some even suggested that the Vatican should focus more on spiritual guidance and less on political issues. In the midst of the backlash, the Pope remained resolute. He understood that his words had consequences, but he also knew that as the leader of the Catholic Church, it was his duty to speak out on behalf of the vulnerable and oppressed. This was not about politics, it was about human dignity. And that, he believed, was the essence of the gospel. Despite the criticism, the Pope's message sparked a groundswell of support from ordinary people, many of whom had long felt that their voices were drowned out by political rhetoric. Thousands took to the streets in cities across Europe, advocating for more compassionate policies toward refugees. Religious communities, especially Catholic organizations, mobilized to provide aid and assistance to those who had been displaced. The Church, led by Pope Francisco II, was stepping into a leadership role in a way that few had expected. But as the world cheered, the Pope faced a deeper challenge: could he maintain the momentum of this moment? The global refugee crisis was only one of many issues that demanded his attention, and the political fallout from his speech was far from over. In the coming days, he would need to navigate the political and diplomatic complexities of the world's most powerful governments. His leadership would be tested further, and the world would be watching closely to see how he would confront the challenges of an increasingly polarized world. In the days following Pope Francisco II's powerful address on the refugee crisis, the global response was nothing short of overwhelming. From the crowded streets of Rome to the farthest reaches of Europe, his message resonated deeply with people of all backgrounds. The Pope's call for compassion and solidarity had sparked something within the hearts of millions, and many felt that, for the first time in a long while, they were being called to take meaningful action. Yet, as is often the case with moments of great upheaval and change, the world did not immediately move in one unified direction. While masses of citizens rallied behind the Pope's vision of a more compassionate world, political leaders, particularly in Europe, began to push back, sharply criticizing the Vatican's involvement in what they viewed as a complex and politically charged issue. Their voices grew louder with each passing day, and a clash of ideals began to unfold in the media and on the global stage. The first to respond publicly was German Chancellor Heinrich Müller, who had long taken a hard stance on immigration. He addressed the media during a summit in Berlin just days after the Pope's speech, making it clear that the Vatican's intervention had crossed a line. Müller, known for his pragmatic approach to policy, insisted that the refugee crisis required careful management and that open borders were not a sustainable solution. "We cannot solve the refugee crisis with mere goodwill," Chancellor Müller stated firmly. "We need pragmatic solutions that account for national security and the stability of our societies." The Church's message, while compassionate, is not grounded in the reality of governing a country. Similarly, France's president, Camille Dufresne, a staunch proponent of stringent immigration laws, echoed Müller's sentiments. In a televised speech, he warned that while he respected the Pope's moral authority, the Church's position on refugees risked disrupting the delicate balance of Europe's social fabric. "We must remember," President Dufresne said, "that governments are elected to make decisions that ensure the safety and well-being of their citizens. Religious leaders, however well-intentioned, do not bear the same responsibility for national security." The backlash from European leaders was swift, and the rhetoric from some of the continent's most powerful figures became more intense as days passed. Media outlets, particularly in the UK and France, began running op-eds that criticized the Vatican's interference in European domestic policies. Public opinion, which had once been largely supportive of Pope Francisco II's stance, started to divide. A significant portion of the European population began to voice their concerns about the long-term impact of accepting more refugees, citing fears of economic instability and increased competition for jobs. The Pope, however, was undeterred. Behind the scenes, he and his closest advisors worked tirelessly to craft a response that would address the concerns raised by the political elite, while still holding firm to the Church's teachings of compassion, justice, and human dignity. He knew that in a world divided by politics and ideologies, he had to maintain his role as a moral leader, someone who would challenge the status quo when it came to the treatment of the vulnerable. On the morning of the Vatican's response, Cardinal Giovanni Vescovi, the spokesperson for the Holy See, addressed the press. The atmosphere inside the Vatican was charged with anticipation. The world awaited the Pope's next move. "We understand the concerns raised by various leaders regarding the complexities of the refugee crisis," Cardinal Vescovi began, his voice calm but resolute. "The Holy See has always recognized the sovereignty of nations. However, as Pope Francisco II has said, this is not only a political issue, it is a moral one. Our responsibility as Catholics is to prioritize the dignity of every human being, and that is why we call on the international community to work together to provide a safe refuge for those fleeing war and persecution." He continued, "The Pope does not ask nations to abandon their security or social policies. What he is asking for is a change of heart, a recognition that refugees are not just numbers or statistics, they are people with families, with dreams, with hopes for a better future. To close our doors to them is to abandon our humanity." The Vatican's response was crafted to acknowledge the complexity of the situation while standing firm in its moral position. The Pope's call for unity, compassion, and cooperation was a message that would not be swayed by political pressure. And while the Vatican understood the challenges involved in the refugee crisis, it would not back down from its stance that the most vulnerable should never be abandoned. As the days unfolded, the Pope's words began to resonate with a broader segment of the global population. Humanitarian organizations, especially those working on the ground in refugee camps, lauded his leadership. Pope Francisco II's insistence on an open-hearted approach inspired thousands of ordinary citizens to take action. Crowds gathered in cities across Europe, holding vigils and marches to show their support for refugees. The Church, through its global network of organizations and charities, began to mobilize resources to provide aid to those in need, from food and medical supplies to shelter and legal assistance. Yet, despite the growing groundswell of support, the political divide continued to widen. European leaders, emboldened by the strong backing of their electorates, maintained their hardline stances. At the same time, more conservative factions within the Church began to question the Pope's approach, arguing that his public stance could undermine the authority of the Church's teachings on other issues, such as family values and religious orthodoxy. Some in the Vatican even speculated that the Pope's bold leadership could risk fracturing the unity of the Catholic Church. Pope Francisco II, however, remained unwavering in his resolve. He believed that his leadership would ultimately be judged not by political compromise but by his fidelity to the gospel. He knew that history would not look kindly on those who had failed to act in the face of human suffering, and he was determined to lead by example. 1 week after his initial speech, the Pope called for a special gathering of world religious leaders, politicians, and humanitarian advocates at the Vatican. It was a bold move, a challenge to the world's leaders to come together and find a path forward, one that could bring both compassion and practical solutions to the refugee crisis. The eyes of the world were on Rome once again, waiting to see if Pope Francisco II's leadership could bridge the divide between moral imperatives and political realities. The world watched in anticipation as Pope Francisco II invited political leaders, religious authorities, and humanitarian organizations from around the globe to the Vatican. It was a bold and ambitious move, an attempt to break through the deep divisions that had emerged over the refugee crisis. The summit, which would be held in the Grand Hall of Blessings, was designed to be a space for dialogue, reflection, and, most importantly, action. Pope Francisco II had always believed that the Church could serve as a unifying force, one that could bridge ideological divides and inspire the world to take collective action on issues of morality, justice, and compassion. But this was a delicate balancing act. Leaders with very different perspectives on the refugee crisis were coming to Rome, each with their own agendas and concerns. The Pope's challenge was not just to inspire agreement but to find common ground in an environment rife with political tension. As the day of the summit approached, preparations at the Vatican were in full swing. The vast hall was transformed into a space for discussion, with a long central table surrounded by chairs for each leader and delegate. Representatives from international organizations like the UN, the Red Cross, and Doctors Without Borders were given prominent seats, alongside heads of state from key European countries. The Vatican itself was represented by Cardinal Giovanni Vescovi, who had become the Pope's closest ally in his efforts to address the refugee crisis. The summit was set to begin with a keynote address from Pope Francisco II, who would lay the foundation for the discussions ahead. It was a high-stakes moment, one that would set the tone for the entire event. Would his words inspire cooperation, or would they spark further division? On the morning of the summit, the Vatican was buzzing with anticipation. The leaders and their aides began to arrive, some with smiles of anticipation, others with furrowed brows, clearly nervous about what was to come. The press was positioned outside, cameras ready to capture every moment. The eyes of the world were focused on Rome, and the pressure was palpable. Inside the Hall of Blessings, Pope Francisco II stood at the podium, his calm and steady demeanor a stark contrast to the tension that filled the room. He began by acknowledging the gravity of the situation, the unprecedented nature of the crisis, and the moral responsibility that each leader had in shaping the response. We are gathered here today not as representatives of political ideologies, but as human beings who have sworn to protect the dignity of every life. The refugee crisis is not just a challenge for one nation or one region, it is a global challenge. And it is a moral imperative that we address it with compassion and with courage. His voice resonated through the hall, steady and authoritative. The Pope's opening words were aimed not just at the heads of state before him but at the entire world. His message was clear: this was not a time for political gamesmanship, but for collective action rooted in the values of justice and humanity. We cannot afford to close our eyes to the suffering that surrounds us. We must act, not out of fear, but out of love, love for our fellow human beings, regardless of their nationality, their religion, or their status. We must build a world where no one is left behind, where refugees are not seen as burdens but as brothers and sisters in need of our help. Pope Francisco II paused, allowing his words to settle in the room. Some leaders nodded in agreement, while others remained stoic, their expressions guarded. The Pope knew that this speech would not be an easy sell to everyone in the room, but it was necessary. It was his call to conscience. This summit is not just about policies and agreements, he continued. It is about our shared responsibility as human beings, as global citizens, to confront the challenges of our time with integrity, compassion, and wisdom. It is about making decisions that will ensure a future where our children will grow up in a world of peace and solidarity, not fear and division. With those words, the Pope concluded his speech. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the moment hanging heavily in the air. No one spoke immediately. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to break the tension. Finally, Chancellor Heinrich Müller of Germany, who had been one of the strongest critics of the Pope's previous speech, stood up. His face was stern, but there was a look of resolve in his eyes. He began speaking slowly, his words measured but firm. Your Holiness, I respect your vision. But the reality is that we live in a world of limited resources. The refugee crisis is not just a moral challenge, it is a logistical and financial one. While I agree with your call for compassion, we must also consider the practicalities. Europe cannot absorb millions of refugees without risking its stability. We must find solutions that are sustainable. Müller's words were met with murmurs of agreement from some of the European delegates. They were not comfortable with the Pope's idealistic approach, but they recognized the political and economic challenges that had led them to adopt stricter immigration policies. They were wary of anything that could threaten their national security or economic systems. Next to speak was President Camille Dufresne of France, who shared similar concerns. We understand the importance of solidarity, Your Holiness, he said. But our people have legitimate concerns about the social and economic impact of increased immigration. We cannot allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by these challenges without addressing the long-term consequences. The tension in the room grew palpable. The Pope had expected resistance, but it stung all the same. The leaders of Europe were united in their skepticism of his call for open borders, and it was clear that the summit would not be an easy conversation. But the Pope was not one to back down. He had come here to challenge the world, to bring leaders to the table and demand that they confront their own fears and prejudices. He knew that change would not come easily, but he also knew that history often required bold leadership in the face of opposition. I understand the challenges you face, Pope Francisco II said calmly, turning toward Chancellor Müller and President Dufresne. But we must recognize that the true cost of inaction is far greater than the challenges we face today. If we turn away from the refugees now, we will be leaving behind a legacy of fear and division. And that is a legacy that none of us can afford. His words hung in the air like a challenge. The room was silent once again. But this time, there was a shift. Some of the delegates who had been quiet began to murmur in agreement, while others appeared deep in thought. For the first time in the summit, the tone had shifted, from confrontation to contemplation. The Pope had laid the groundwork. The summit would not be easy, but it had begun. And there was still time for something meaningful to emerge from the gathering. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? As the summit unfolded in the Vatican, the tension in the air was palpable. Leaders from across the world had gathered under one roof, each carrying with them their own burdens, the weight of their country's policies, their people's fears, and the complex reality of the refugee crisis. Pope Francisco II had boldly invited them to the table, but the question remained, would they be able to bridge the divide between moral duty and national interest? The first few hours of the summit were marked by heated debates. European leaders, particularly Chancellor Heinrich Müller and President Camille Dufresne, continued to voice their concerns about the logistical and economic challenges of accepting more refugees. Meanwhile, humanitarian organizations pushed back, arguing that the moral imperative to act outweighed the political and financial hurdles. The room seemed to be a battleground, each speaker representing a different camp, all seemingly stuck in their own worldview. But Pope Francisco II had anticipated this. He knew that the road to consensus would be long and fraught with opposition, but he also believed in the power of dialogue. The Pope was a master of creating space for people to hear one another, even when their positions seemed irreconcilable. He wasn't interested in forcing agreement, instead, he wanted to create the conditions for empathy and understanding to take root. As the debates raged on, the Pope quietly signaled to Cardinal Giovanni Vescovi, who was seated at the table next to him. Cardinal Vescovi, aware of the Pope's strategy, stood up and addressed the room with calm authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cardinal Vescovi began, his voice steady, "we are all aware of the challenges before us. But let us remember that we are not here simply to defend the positions of our respective countries. We are here because we share a common humanity. The refugees are not just statistics, they are mothers, fathers, children, people who have fled unspeakable horrors in search of safety and hope." The cardinal paused, allowing his words to sink in. "We must find a way to act with both compassion and wisdom. We cannot allow fear to dictate our actions. We must look for solutions that respect both the dignity of those in need and the concerns of those who are already bearing the burdens of this crisis." There was a shift in the room. Some of the European leaders seemed to soften, and even Chancellor Muller appeared to be contemplating the cardinal's words. The atmosphere, though still tense, had begun to shift from confrontation to cooperation. Pope Francisco too then stood, signaling that he too had something to say. His voice, though quiet, carried the weight of 1,000 years of history, of a church that had always fought for the marginalized. "We cannot solve this crisis with policies alone. We must act with our hearts as well as our minds. The refugee crisis is not just about borders or economics, it is about people. It is about recognizing the inherent dignity of every human life, no matter where they come from, no matter the color of their skin or the faith they follow." The Pope's words were met with silence. The room was still, as if the weight of his message had caused even the most hardened leaders to pause. Then, a surprising voice broke the silence, the voice of Lydia Alvarado, a humanitarian worker who had dedicated her life to helping refugees in the Middle East and North Africa. "Your Holiness," Lydia began, standing before the room. "I have seen firsthand the suffering of refugees. I have held their hands as they told me stories of loss, of families torn apart, of children lost in the chaos of war. I have seen the fear in their eyes when they cross borders, hoping for safety but often finding only more hardship. And I have seen the beauty of what happens when people come together to help, when nations open their hearts, when communities rise to the occasion." Lydia's voice was raw with emotion, and her words cut through the tension like a knife. For a moment, the room was silent again. Her testimony had brought the harsh realities of the crisis to the forefront, forcing even the most skeptical leaders to confront the human cost of their decisions. "We cannot close our hearts," Lydia continued, her voice firm but compassionate. "The refugees are not a threat to our safety or our way of life. They are a test of our humanity. How we respond to their suffering will define us, not just as politicians, but as human beings." It was a powerful moment. The room, filled with some of the most powerful individuals in the world, was united in a moment of shared humanity. Even those who had been vocal in their opposition to the Pope's message seemed moved by Lydia's words. Slowly, one by one, leaders began to speak up, not with the hard-edged rhetoric they had come with, but with a newfound recognition of the urgency of the situation. Chancellor Muller, who had been the most vocal critic of the Pope's position, spoke first. "I have been too focused on the practicalities of this crisis," he admitted, his voice tinged with an uncharacteristic humility. "But hearing these testimonies, hearing the stories of those who have experienced the pain and fear of being a refugee, I recognize that this is not just an issue of logistics. This is a matter of the heart. And we must find a way to balance our national concerns with our moral responsibility." President Dufresne, too, softened his stance. "The Pope is right," he said. "We must not let fear dictate our actions. We must look for ways to help those in need while also protecting our citizens. We cannot close our doors to those who are suffering." As the summit progressed, the tone of the discussions shifted. The leaders began to discuss concrete solutions, with many proposing a mix of humanitarian aid, increased funding for refugee programs, and greater international cooperation. There was still much to debate, and the road ahead would not be easy, but the seeds of unity had been planted. By the end of the day, Pope Francisco II had succeeded in doing something that many had thought impossible. He had brought together leaders who had previously been divided by politics and ideology, and made them see the refugee crisis through the lens of shared humanity. It was a small victory, but a significant one. The summit had not solved the crisis, but it had opened the door to a new kind of conversation, one that prioritized compassion, dialogue, and cooperation. As the summit drew to a close, Pope Francisco II addressed the room one last time, his voice filled with quiet determination. We have taken the first steps today. We have opened our hearts to one another, and we have recognized that this crisis is not something we can solve alone. But together, with faith, compassion, and courage, we can build a world where no one is left behind. The room erupted in a hesitant but hopeful applause. The summit was over, but the work had just begun. The world watched as the leaders left the Vatican, the summit's discussions still fresh in their minds. The images of Pope Francisco II standing with world leaders, a collective sense of cautious optimism hanging in the air, were broadcast across the globe. But the real question remained: would the words spoken in that sacred hall translate into action? Would the promises made turn into tangible solutions, or would they dissolve into political rhetoric? As the dust settled after the summit, the global community found itself divided. Some hailed the event as a historic turning point, a moment where the moral imperative of the refugee crisis had been acknowledged by those in power. Others were more skeptical, pointing to the lack of concrete steps and binding commitments. Leaders returned to their countries, some with renewed enthusiasm, others more cautious, and in some cases, the complex negotiations that followed the summit led to heated political infighting. Pope Francisco II returned to the Vatican with a sense of both hope and determination. The summit had achieved something important: it had opened the door to dialogue. But the Pope knew that dialogue alone would not solve the crisis. He understood the complexities involved and the deep political divides that would make any solution difficult. But he also knew that change, real and lasting change, always begins with a spark. And for him, the spark had been lit. Cardinal Giovanni Vescari, ever the strategist, was quick to remind the Pope that the next phase would require skillful diplomacy. "Your Holiness," he said, "you've started something powerful here, but now the challenge is to ensure that the momentum doesn't fade. We need to keep the pressure on, hold the leaders accountable." The Pope nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Cardinal. I'm aware. But we must also be patient. This is not a battle to be won overnight. We have to ensure that this moment does not become another passing event. We must inspire action at every level, in governments, in communities, and in the hearts of ordinary people." Meanwhile, global reactions to the summit varied. Some of the world's most influential media outlets, like the New York Times and BBC, covered the event with optimism, highlighting the shift in tone among the European leaders. "A call for unity," one headline read, "Pope's summit brings hope for refugees." But others, particularly conservative outlets, were more critical. "Empty words, empty promises," read a headline from a leading right-wing news network, questioning whether the summit would lead to any meaningful change on the ground. Despite the differing opinions in the media, one thing became clear: the Pope had forced the world to confront the refugee crisis head-on. His call for compassion had resonated with people from all walks of life. Demonstrations and rallies for refugees took place in major cities around the world, with citizens demanding that their governments take action. In Germany, Chancellor Heinrich Müller faced pressure from within his own government. His stance at the summit, while softer than before, had still been a point of contention. The conservative wing of his party demanded stricter measures to control immigration, arguing that the economic and social stability of the country was at risk. Müller found himself caught between the Pope's moral call and the hard political reality of his nation's concerns. Back in the United States, President Valerie Smith, who had attended the summit virtually, found herself in a similar bind. The refugee issue had become a political flashpoint, with both parties accusing each other of being either too lenient or too harsh. The president had promised during her campaign to take a more compassionate approach to refugees, but now the political realities were weighing heavily on her administration. As the weeks went by, it became clear that the summit had done more than just open doors for dialogue, it had sparked a movement. Grassroots organizations, inspired by the Pope's words, began organizing efforts to support refugees directly. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples across the world raised funds, volunteered time, and opened their doors to displaced families. Refugee resettlement programs received an influx of support from everyday people who had heard the Pope's call and wanted to make a difference. But despite this outpouring of compassion, the political leaders who had attended the summit were still locked in gridlock. Diplomatic negotiations stalled, with key sticking points such as quotas, border security, and the burden on host countries continuing to divide the room. Each country had its own set of priorities, and while some were eager to open their doors to refugees, others were more focused on the strain such policies could place on their own citizens. Pope Francisco too, knowing that time was not on his side, decided to take matters into his own hands. He called for a second meeting, a smaller, more focused gathering of key world leaders, business magnates, and humanitarian figures. The goal this time was not to engage in grandiose speeches, but to come up with actionable solutions. It was time to get down to the specifics. The invitation list was intentionally selective. Those who had shown genuine interest in the summit's goals, those who had recognized the urgency of the situation, were the ones invited. Leaders like Chancellor Muller and President Dufresne were among those called back to Rome, as were key representatives from the United Nations, the World Bank, and other international organizations. The meeting, held in a private wing of the Vatican, began with a stark reminder from the Pope. He opened the discussion by stating, "The world is watching. And more importantly, so is history. We are at a crossroads, one where we can choose to act with humanity and foresight, or we can turn away and let the suffering continue. We are all accountable for the future we create." The room was silent, each leader reflecting on the gravity of his words. The stakes were higher now. The summit had ignited a sense of global responsibility, but the question remained, would these leaders step up to the challenge? Chancellor Muller, now back in Rome, once again took the floor. This time, his tone was less defensive. "Your Holiness," he began, "I see the urgency. Germany, like many countries, is facing immense challenges. But I recognize that we cannot turn a blind eye. We must find a balanced solution, one that addresses both the immediate humanitarian needs and the long-term stability of our societies." President Dufresne echoed similar sentiments, his once firm stance on border control softened. "France is committed to taking action. But we need partners, not just in Europe, but globally. We cannot shoulder this alone. The responsibility must be shared." The conversations were difficult and fraught with disagreements, but there was a sense of unity in the air. The Pope's vision had slowly begun to transform into a more pragmatic framework for action. Leaders were beginning to realize that they could not afford to ignore the crisis any longer. The Second Vatican meeting had ignited a new wave of discussions. The world leaders, diplomats, and humanitarian figures gathered around the table were beginning to realize the extent of their collective responsibility. The hour had come to move beyond borders, beyond political divides, and focus on a solution for the refugees who had nowhere to turn but to the mercy of the international community. As the Pope sat silently at the head of the table, watching the world leaders debate, there was an underlying sense of urgency in the room. The weight of history, of suffering, and of responsibility hung thick in the air. The summit had set the stage, but now it was time for concrete actions. Pope Francisco too, with a steady gaze and quiet authority, finally spoke. "We can no longer afford to look at this crisis through the lens of national self-interest. Our common humanity must guide us. It is not enough to talk about what we cannot do. We must focus on what we can do, and what we must do, for the sake of the people who are suffering at our doorsteps." His words reverberated through the room. Despite the ongoing debates and the practical challenges, one thing was becoming clear: this was no longer just a matter of diplomacy or politics. This was a moral imperative. Chancellor Heinrich Müller, the leader of Germany, was the first to break the silence after the Pope's words. Though he had initially resisted the idea of taking in large numbers of refugees, his tone had softened significantly in recent weeks. The pressure from both his party and the growing tide of public opinion had forced him to reconsider his position. The refugee crisis is not just an issue for one country, he said thoughtfully, leaning forward in his seat. Germany cannot bear this burden alone. We need international cooperation. We need countries to share responsibility, not just in resettling refugees, but in supporting them through integration, education, healthcare, employment opportunities. We must make sure they can rebuild their lives with dignity. The Pope nodded in agreement, his eyes full of compassion for those caught in the middle of this human tragedy. Exactly, he said. We cannot allow refugees to be a burden. We must make them part of the global community, not as objects of charity, but as fellow human beings with rights, dreams, and potential. President Camille Dufresne of France was the next to speak, her voice firm but not unkind. France has always been a country that stands for liberty, equality, and fraternity. But we are also facing severe challenges. The economic strain of accepting refugees is real. What I am hearing today, from the Pope and from my fellow leaders, is that we must act, but we must also create a framework where countries are supported in sharing the load. For the first time, the European leaders seemed to align. There was an understanding that the solution could not rest on the shoulders of a few countries. The Pope had proposed the idea of an international coalition, a coalition that would include wealthy nations, emerging economies, and developing countries. It was a bold proposal, and one that would require significant negotiation, but it seemed to be the only way forward. In the back of the room, President Valerie Smith of the United States sat pensively. She had been relatively quiet during the summit, her mind racing with the implications of the discussions. The U.S. had long been a leader in humanitarian aid, but taking in refugees was a more politically charged issue, especially with the rising tide of nationalism that had gripped the country. As the discussions continued, Smith realized that the U.S. could not afford to sit on the sidelines. The eyes of the world were on them, and as one of the wealthiest nations in the world, America had a responsibility to lead. If we are to move forward, the United States will take on a leading role, Smith said finally, breaking her silence. We have the resources to help, and we will provide funding for refugee resettlement. But we will also ask for a broader international effort to share the burden. This is not just about taking in refugees, it's about creating a system where nations work together to support them. Her statement was met with a mixture of approval and skepticism. Some countries, particularly those in the global south, were wary of the U.S. commitment. They had seen similar promises in the past, only to see them fall short. But there was something different in Smith's tone, a sense of resolve that had not been present before. The U.S. commitment was pivotal. If America could make good on its promises, it would set a precedent for other wealthy nations to follow suit. The summit was drawing to a close, but the discussions had sparked the beginning of a new international coalition, one that would focus on shared responsibility. As the leaders discussed specifics, they began to agree on the need for a coordinated response. The coalition would focus on 4 key areas. 1. Funding for refugee resettlement and integration. Nations would commit to providing financial support for refugee resettlement, with a focus on education, healthcare, and employment. This would allow refugees to rebuild their lives with dignity and contribute to their host countries. 2. Shared quotas for resettlement. Countries would agree to share the responsibility of resettling refugees based on their economic capacity, with a particular focus on wealthier nations and emerging economies taking a proportionate share. 3. Border security and human rights protections. A balance would be struck between ensuring the safety of host countries and protecting the human rights of refugees. This would involve enhanced border security measures while ensuring that refugees are not turned away at borders. 4. Regional cooperation. countries and regions that were disproportionately affected by the refugee crisis, such as those in the Middle East and North Africa, would receive additional support to deal with the crisis. Neighboring countries would work together to ensure that refugees were given safe passage and access to basic services. This framework, though ambitious, was a start. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. But for the first time in history, there was an international consensus on the need to move beyond borders and build a collective response to the refugee crisis. As the summit ended, the Pope stood up and addressed the room for one last time. His voice was calm but filled with conviction. "What we have accomplished here today is only the beginning," he said. "The path ahead will not be easy. There will be setbacks. There will be challenges. But I believe that this is a turning point. The world has seen the suffering of refugees, and the world has responded. We must now walk together, as one global family, to ensure that no one is left behind." The room erupted in applause, tentative but hopeful. The leaders knew that the work had just begun. They had agreed on a vision, but now they would have to make it a reality. It was a monumental task, but for the first time in a long while, there was a glimmer of hope that change was possible. As the Pope left the room, he couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he believed in the power of compassion, in the power of collective action. And as the summit ended, he knew that the work was far from over. The Vatican summit had been a historic moment, a rare instance where world leaders came together in the name of a singular cause. But as the dust began to settle and the summit's fervor began to fade, the true test of this ambitious initiative had only just begun. The world's response to the formation of the international coalition would determine whether this moment would remain a footnote in history or become the catalyst for real, sustainable change. The announcement of the Vatican coalition made headlines across the globe. Newspapers, social media, and news broadcasts covered the summit's resolutions with mixed reactions. To some, it was the dawn of a new era in international cooperation, a breakthrough moment for refugees who had been left in the lurch for far too long. But for others, it felt like more political posturing, just another in a long line of diplomatic gestures that would fade into nothingness. The Pope, in his quiet wisdom, knew that there was much work to be done, and his role had only just begun. He understood the challenges ahead, but he also saw something that many of the world's leaders were beginning to overlook: this movement could not solely be driven by politicians or organizations. The heart of this movement would lie with the people. The everyday citizens who had shown up at rallies, donated money, or opened their doors to refugees would be the true power behind the initiative. As the international community digested the summit's results, grassroots organizations across the world mobilized in response. In cities across Europe, the United States, and the Global South, people gathered to show their support for refugees. They were no longer just responding to a call from a religious leader, they were answering a moral question that had been left unanswered for too long. In Berlin, a group of young activists stood outside the German parliament holding signs that read, "Refugees welcome," and "No one is illegal." Their message was clear: the world's leaders had taken the first step, but now it was time for citizens to hold them accountable. In New York City, volunteer groups teamed up with local churches and community centers to provide aid to incoming refugees. Donations poured in from individuals who had once been indifferent to the crisis but had been moved by the Pope's words. The local government, under pressure from the public, began to expand its refugee resettlement programs, offering language courses, job training, and mental health services to those displaced. Across the globe, in places like Lebanon and Jordan, the refugee camps were seeing a shift as well. International NGOs, who had been working in these regions for years, now had a renewed sense of urgency. The Vatican Coalition's financial promises were starting to trickle down into support on the ground. Refugees who had been living in limbo began to feel a faint sense of hope, as education programs and healthcare services saw increased funding. Yet, while the grassroots movements were growing in strength, political resistance was just as palpable. Not all governments shared the optimism that had emerged from the Vatican summit. Back in the United States, the Trump administration's hardline stance on immigration continued to dominate the conversation. The rhetoric of nationalism and protectionism, which had resonated so powerfully in the 2016 election, was far from gone. President Smith found herself under immense pressure from her party's base, who viewed the Pope's call as overly idealistic and impractical. "We cannot simply open our borders," the president's chief of staff warned her. "You'll face a backlash from the American people. They want security, they want jobs, they don't want to be saddled with the responsibility of these refugees." Despite the opposition, President Smith remained determined to fulfill her commitment to the Vatican coalition. But the political tension was palpable. The country was deeply divided on the refugee issue. One side argued for the moral obligation to help those in need, while the other warned of the dangers posed by unchecked immigration. In Germany, Chancellor Müller faced similar challenges. While the Pope's summit had generated international support, domestically, the debate around immigration was heated. The far-right wing of his party seized on the refugee issue, using it to rally their base and increase their influence in the upcoming elections. "If we don't control this influx, Germany will lose its identity," one vocal opposition leader argued on national television. "We cannot let ourselves be overwhelmed by refugees who have no place in our country." Müller, however, was resolute in his belief that Germany could lead the way. He had been on the front lines of the refugee crisis for years and had seen the benefits of integrating refugees into society. But even he knew that the public's perception would be difficult to shift. Despite the political pushback, the international coalition, which had begun as an idea in the Vatican, began to take shape. The Pope had made it clear from the start that this was not just a European issue or a Middle Eastern issue, it was a global issue that required a global response. The Vatican's diplomatic team worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that countries from all corners of the globe were involved in this new coalition. The United Nations, which had been critical in responding to the crisis in the early days, joined the coalition's efforts, bringing its expertise in refugee law and international governance. In Asia, Japan and South Korea took leadership in offering economic support and humanitarian aid to countries bearing the brunt of the refugee crisis. Latin American countries like Brazil and Mexico, long acquainted with their own migratory challenges, committed to opening their borders and sharing resources with their global counterparts. Even in countries with smaller refugee populations, leaders recognized the moral imperative to support the effort. Argentina's president, Alejandro Torres, publicly pledged that his nation would be a key participant, offering financial support and committing to resettling a portion of the refugees displaced by the crisis. However, despite these positive movements, some nations remained hesitant. Russia, China, and several Eastern European countries declined to join the coalition. These countries continued to argue that their own national interests took precedence and that they could not be expected to bear the burden of the global refugee crisis. The Pope, observing these developments, continued to advocate for unity, even in the face of resistance. He urged that this crisis be viewed not as an inconvenience or a burden but as an opportunity to build a more compassionate and interconnected world. "Humanity is not divided by borders," he had said in a speech to the United Nations earlier that year. "We are all part of one human family. The refugee is not an other. The refugee is a neighbor, a friend, and a fellow traveler on this journey of life. We must not let the walls of fear and division define who we are. We must instead build bridges of hope and compassion." The Pope's call for unity echoed across the globe, reverberating in the halls of international institutions, and among the grassroots activists working tirelessly to make the vision of the Vatican summit a reality. As the world grappled with its collective response, the challenges remained. Would the international community fulfill the promises made at the Vatican summit? Would political leaders across the globe follow through with the commitments made in those sacred halls? For now, the fate of the refugee crisis rested in the hands of the global community. And though there was reason for hope, the journey ahead was long, filled with obstacles and setbacks. But one thing was certain, the world would never be the same. The spark of compassion had been lit, and as more and more people became engaged in this global effort, the the dream of a more just and compassionate world began to take shape, one small step at a time. Months had passed since the Vatican summit, and while there was a sense of hope that the international coalition would bring lasting change, the reality on the ground was far more complex. The promises made by world leaders had yet to be fully realized, and the refugee crisis, already one of the most pressing humanitarian issues in modern history, was deepening. The refugee camps in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon had reached capacity. Thousands of refugees continued to pour into Europe and other regions, seeking sanctuary. But as the numbers swelled, so did the political and logistical challenges that had seemed so simple on paper. The promises of resettlement and financial aid that had been so freely made at the Vatican summit were now being tested by the overwhelming scale of the crisis. The global community was facing a crucial turning point. Would they be able to follow through on their commitments, or would the weight of their own political and economic limitations cause the momentum to falter? At the heart of the crisis was the growing strain on the international coalition. Leaders who had initially been eager to take action began to waver. Political pressures at home, rising populism, and the sheer complexity of organizing such a large-scale humanitarian effort were starting to take their toll. In the United States, President Valerie Smith found herself increasingly isolated on the refugee issue. The American public, especially those on the conservative side, had grown impatient with the idea of accepting more refugees. The anti-immigrant rhetoric that had dominated the previous administration had not vanished, it had merely shifted, finding a new voice in populist movements across the country. "How many more do we have to take in?" asked Senator Henry Donovan, a vocal critic of the refugee resettlement plan. "Our own citizens are suffering. The economy is faltering, and we're giving away our resources to people who aren't even our own." The president, aware of the growing opposition, found herself caught between the moral imperative to help and the political reality of the moment. She had promised to lead the U.S. into the coalition, but her support was thinning. The political fallout was looming large, and even her own party was beginning to question her commitment to the cause. In Germany, Chancellor Müller faced similar dilemmas. While the refugee crisis had brought the country to the forefront of the international discussion, it had also sparked significant domestic unrest. The far-right wing of his party, along with a growing segment of the population, was increasingly vocal in their opposition to immigration. "We cannot take any more," Müller's interior minister had argued at a recent cabinet meeting. "The resources are stretched thin, and the public is growing restless. We need to secure our borders. We need to focus on our own citizens." Yet Müller, like Smith, had made a commitment at the Vatican summit. He knew that the eyes of the world were still watching. The promises made were not just diplomatic gestures, they were lifelines for millions of people. As the strain on the coalition grew, some countries began to pull back from their commitments. In Eastern Europe, nations like Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic remained steadfast in their refusal to accept refugees. They argued that their resources were too limited and that the refugee crisis posed a threat to their national security. In the wake of these refusals, the Vatican coalition began to fracture. Countries that had been eager to join the effort in principle were now questioning their ability to follow through. The financial support promised by wealthy nations like the US and Germany began to fall short, as the political and economic realities of these countries took precedence over international diplomacy. Meanwhile, in regions like the Middle East, where the refugee crisis had begun, the situation was becoming increasingly dire. The camps in Lebanon and Jordan were overwhelmed. Healthcare systems were collapsing under the weight of the influx, and schools were no longer able to accommodate the growing number of children in need of an education. In Turkey, the government struggled to maintain the fragile peace in the refugee camps near its southern border. The country had taken in millions of refugees, but the sheer volume was unsustainable. Tensions were rising as local populations, feeling the strain of their own economic hardships, began to turn against the refugees. Amid the political wrangling, the situation for the refugees continued to deteriorate. Families who had fled violence and oppression found themselves trapped in limbo, with no clear future ahead of them. Many had already endured years of uncertainty in overcrowded camps. Now, they were faced with the bitter reality that the world's promises were becoming empty. In a refugee camp on the outskirts of Beirut, a young Syrian mother named Layla sat with her 2 children, looking at the sky. The dust from the nearby construction site settled over the camp, a constant reminder of the refugees' precarious situation. The tents, which had once offered a semblance of safety, were now falling apart under the harsh sun and the weight of the refugees' dreams of a better life. "When will we be able to leave?" Layla whispered to her daughter, whose face was streaked with dirt and sadness. Her daughter, barely old enough to understand the complexities of the world, clung to her mother's side. Layla had heard the promises made by world leaders, the talk of resettlement, the hope that things would change. But now, after years of waiting, the hope seemed more distant than ever. Nearby, a group of young men had gathered, sharing stories of the places they once called home. Their faces were filled with both anger and hopelessness. They had been promised a future, a chance to rebuild their lives. But all they had found was another life of waiting, waiting for answers, for food, for the chance to make a difference in their lives. As the refugee crisis deepened, it became clear that the world's leaders were struggling to keep the promises they had made. There was a growing sense of frustration among the refugees and the humanitarian organizations that had been working tirelessly to assist them. "The world has forgotten us," said Amir, a refugee from Afghanistan, as he sat outside a makeshift clinic in Athens. "We are just statistics to them now. Every day we hear about new agreements, new coalitions. But when it comes to action, nothing changes." The sense of betrayal was palpable. Refugees who had once placed their hopes in international efforts to help them were now disillusioned by the slow-moving bureaucracy and broken promises. The Pope, though aware of the difficulties, remained steadfast. He knew that this crisis would not be solved overnight, and that the journey toward a more compassionate world would require perseverance. In a speech broadcast globally, Pope Francis II addressed the world's leaders once again. "We cannot afford to turn away. The refugees are not a problem to be solved, they are a call to our shared humanity. We must not let politics and division undermine the hopes of those who are suffering. We must stay the course, even when the road ahead is uncertain." His words, though simple, resonated deeply. They reminded the world that the refugee crisis was not a temporary challenge, it was a test of the world's moral character, of its willingness to stand united in the face of human suffering. As the world continued to grapple with the complexities of the crisis, one thing was clear: the fight for the refugees was far from over. But the flame of hope, though flickering, had not yet gone out. The pressure on the international coalition had reached a breaking point. As the months dragged on, the promises made at the Vatican summit began to feel more like distant memories than actionable commitments. Refugee camps continued to swell beyond capacity, and the cracks within the coalition were becoming impossible to ignore. But just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a single event would spark a shift in the global conversation, a turning point that might finally bring the world together. It came in the form of a young refugee named Hannah, a Syrian girl who had survived an impossible journey. Her story was one of unimaginable loss and perseverance, and it would become the catalyst for a global awakening. Hannah's story began in the bombed-out ruins of Aleppo. She had been only 8 years old when the war came to her home, when the streets she once played in turned to rubble, and when the sounds of war became her constant companion. She had lost both of her parents to the violence and had been forced to flee with her younger brother, Samir. They traveled for months, crossing dangerous borders, surviving on scraps of food and the kindness of strangers. Finally, after a grueling journey, they found themselves in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Beirut. But it wasn't until one cold December morning, when Hannah's brother Samir fell ill, that her story would gain international attention. In the camp, resources were stretched thin. Medical supplies were scarce, and the clinic was overwhelmed with patients. Samir's condition worsened rapidly, and despite Hannah's desperate pleas, there was nothing that could be done. He passed away in her arms, just as the sun began to rise over the camp. Hannah's heartbreaking loss became a symbol of the untold suffering of millions of refugees. Her image, clutching her brother's lifeless body, was captured by a photographer and went viral across the world. It was a tragic moment, but it was also a pivotal one. The photo of Hannah holding her brother ignited a firestorm of global outrage. It wasn't just a tragic story, it was a wake-up call to the world. The image of this young girl, torn from her home, and then losing the last member of her family, became the visual representation of the suffering that had been ongoing for years. The world could no longer look away. Governments, international organizations, and even ordinary citizens began to take action in unprecedented ways. Protests erupted in major cities, demanding that world leaders step up and fulfill the promises made at the Vatican summit. People who had been indifferent to the refugee crisis now found themselves compelled to act. Citizens mobilized, urging their governments to do more, to offer more, to take responsibility for the lives that had been destroyed. In the United States, a coalition of advocacy groups launched a nationwide campaign called Hannah's Hope. They used the viral image to humanize the issue, pushing for an immediate increase in refugee resettlement quotas. They also called for more resources to be allocated to refugee camps, ensuring that no more children like Samir would have to die due to preventable causes. The Pope, too, spoke out. In a passionate address to the United Nations, he said, "Hannah's story is not just one of tragedy. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and it is a reminder that we must act. We cannot ignore the suffering of our fellow human beings. We must be the hope that they seek. We must be the light in their darkest hour." The Pope's words resonated deeply. And for the first time in months, there was a renewed sense of urgency among the global community. As the public outcry grew, so did the pressure on world leaders to take decisive action. In Washington, President Valerie Smith found herself facing a major crossroads. The country was deeply divided over immigration, but Hannah's story had created a moment of moral clarity. The president, who had struggled to maintain her position within her party on the refugee issue, now saw an opportunity to lead with compassion. In an unprecedented move, President Smith addressed the nation, speaking directly to the American people. "We have failed our fellow human beings," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We have allowed politics to cloud our moral obligation. But today, I stand before you to say that we will not turn our backs on the world's most vulnerable. We will take in more refugees. We will provide the resources necessary to ensure their safety. And we will do it together, as one nation, as one humanity." The president's speech was met with both applause and criticism. But her decision to take bold action sent shockwaves across the political landscape. Even the most hardened opponents of immigration were forced to confront the reality of the refugee crisis. For the first time in years, there was a shift in the political conversation. The question was no longer whether or not to help, but how to do so in a way that was sustainable and compassionate. In Europe, Chancellor Müller followed suit, addressing the German people with a similar call for unity and action. He pledged to increase Germany's refugee intake, to expand resources for refugee camps, and to work more closely with other European countries to ensure that the burden was shared equitably. The European Union, in turn, began to draft a new framework for refugee resettlement, one that would seek to distribute the responsibility more evenly across member states. The momentum that had been sparked by Hannah's tragedy culminated in an emergency summit held at the United Nations. World leaders gathered in New York to discuss concrete steps to address the refugee crisis. The summit was a moment of high-stakes diplomacy, where the promises made in the wake of the Vatican summit would be put to the test. The Pope, as well as representatives from the Vatican, were present, offering their support and guidance. In a speech to the gathering, the Pope once again called for unity and compassion. "The time for division is over," he said. "The time for action is now. Let us put aside our differences and come together as one global community, bound by our shared humanity. We must ensure that no more children like Hannah, no more families like hers, are left behind." The summit produced a series of groundbreaking agreements. Countries committed to increasing their refugee intake, bolstering financial support for refugee camps, and establishing a new international fund dedicated to the long-term integration of refugees into society. The European Union agreed to a new policy that would prevent countries from opting out of the refugee resettlement program, ensuring a fairer distribution of responsibility. The turning point that had begun with Hannah's tragedy was now a full-fledged global movement. The world was waking up to the reality that the refugee crisis was not an isolated issue, it was a test of the world's collective conscience. And while there was still much to be done, the first steps had been taken. The promises made at the Vatican summit were no longer distant ideals, they were becoming a tangible reality. But even as the international community took action, Hannah's image continued to haunt them. It was a reminder that for every child like Hannah, there were millions more whose futures remained uncertain. The fight was far from over, but the hope that had been reignited was undeniable. The world had taken its first decisive steps toward resolving the refugee crisis, but the journey ahead was far from certain. The promises made in the wake of Hannah's tragic story had ignited a global firestorm of compassion, but now the world had to deliver. The true test of these commitments would not lie in speeches or summits, but in the long, hard work of integrating millions of displaced people into new societies, work that would challenge even the most well-intentioned governments and organizations. The refugee crisis, as immense and complex as it was, had reached a critical juncture. While the international community had finally come together to act, the real difficulty now lay in the details, the practicalities of resettling families, providing education, healthcare, and jobs, and ensuring that refugees were not simply moved from one place of suffering to another. The global coalition had passed the point of no return, but would it be able to follow through on its promises, or would this moment of hope dissipate under the weight of reality? As countries ramped up their refugee intake, the real work of resettlement began. In the United States, President Valerie Smith's commitment to accepting more refugees was met with both praise and resistance. Her bold stance was applauded by humanitarian groups and the global community, but it also sparked an intense political backlash at home. The rise of anti-immigrant sentiment, amplified by populist movements, had left deep scars in American politics. The resettlement process, though essential, was no easy task. Over the next few months, the U.S. government struggled to find suitable housing, jobs, and community support for the thousands of refugees arriving from Syria, Afghanistan, and parts of Africa. Local governments and non-profit organizations scrambled to meet the urgent demand for resources, and many communities found themselves ill-prepared for the influx. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Houston, refugee families were housed in temporary shelters, their futures uncertain. The American public had been moved by Hannah's story and the wave of compassion that followed, but the reality of resettling so many people with such diverse needs was daunting. Refugees, many of whom had fled with only the clothes on their backs, found themselves struggling to navigate a complex system that seemed more interested in bureaucracy than in their well-being. In a small neighborhood in Chicago, a Syrian family of 4 stood outside their new apartment, their belongings piled high in cardboard boxes. Ahmad, the father, looked out over the street, his face a mix of hope and anxiety. "This is our new life," he said quietly to his wife, Zainab, who stood beside him, their 2 children holding on to their hands. But despite their relief at being safe from the violence of war, Ahmad and Zainab knew their journey was just beginning. They had no jobs, no income, and no network of support in a city so far from the life they had known. Ahmad had worked as an engineer back in Syria, but his qualifications were not recognized in the United States. Zainab had been a teacher, but she was unsure if her degree would be valid here. Like many refugees, they were forced to navigate a bureaucratic maze that felt overwhelming and unfamiliar. They had no choice but to rely on local non-profit organizations and the kindness of strangers to make their new life a reality. Even in the countries that had embraced refugees, the process of integration proved to be a challenge. In Germany, Chancellor Muller's government had pledged to increase its refugee intake, and cities across the country had begun to receive large numbers of refugees. But the scale of the integration effort was enormous, and despite their best intentions, the system was struggling to keep up. In Berlin, the local authorities had set up temporary housing for refugees, but space was limited, and conditions were cramped. The language barrier was one of the first hurdles, as many refugees struggled to learn German, the key to finding a job and integrating into society. Vocational training programs, which could help refugees find work, were underfunded and under-resourced. As the months passed, the gap between the promises made by the government and the reality of life for refugees began to widen. In the streets of Berlin, former refugees who had arrived months before were now pushing for better job opportunities and support. Mahmoud, a Syrian refugee who had arrived in Germany with his wife and 2 young children, had found work in a construction crew. He had been lucky, but many of his friends were not. "I am grateful for the opportunity to work," Mahmoud said. "But many of us still live in uncertainty. We don't know what our future holds." The challenges were compounded by rising anti-refugee sentiment in certain parts of German society. Although most Germans were welcoming, far-right groups began to protest the influx of refugees, arguing that the country's resources were already stretched thin. Chancellor Müller faced increasing political pressure, not just from his own party, but from the general public, to limit the number of refugees accepted. Despite these challenges, Müller remained steadfast. "We cannot turn our backs on the most vulnerable," he said in a televised speech. "We are a nation of values, and we will stand by those values even when it is difficult." Across Europe and the United States, the costs of inaction were becoming increasingly apparent. Refugees, who had fled violence, war, and poverty, found themselves at the mercy of complex bureaucratic systems and overstretched governments. Many were stuck in a cycle of waiting for resettlement, waiting for approval, waiting for the opportunity to rebuild their lives. In Greece, the situation was no better. Thousands of refugees continued to live in overcrowded camps on the islands, where the conditions were deplorable. Local governments struggled to provide even basic necessities like food, water, and sanitation. Refugee children were not attending school, and many adults had little hope of finding meaningful employment. But despite the dire circumstances, there were also moments of resilience and hope. Local organizations, like the Greek Council for Refugees, worked tirelessly to ensure that those in the camps had access to legal aid and psychological support. Volunteers from across Europe arrived to help, bringing with them supplies and a renewed sense of solidarity. "We may be few," said Dimitris, a volunteer who had been working in the camps for months, "but we can make a difference. Each person we help, each child we provide for, is a victory." The international community, recognizing the growing challenges, pledged to increase financial and logistical support for the refugee effort. The European Union expanded its budget for refugee assistance, and humanitarian organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, ramped up their operations. But while the resources were increasing, the challenges remained immense. The refugee crisis was not something that could be solved overnight. It required sustained effort, long-term planning, and a commitment from all nations, not just to provide temporary aid but to create a system that would allow refugees to build new lives in their host countries. The road ahead was long, but as President Smith, Chancellor Müller, and other world leaders reiterated, it was a road that the global community had no choice but to walk together. "Our shared humanity demands it," Smith said in a speech before Congress. "And together, we will not fail." As the refugee crisis entered a new phase, the world's collective resolve was tested not only by logistical hurdles but by deeper, more existential questions about identity, resources, and what it meant to be a global community. While the initial wave of resettlements had been marked by optimism, the reality of long-term integration was proving far more complicated. Refugees were arriving in unprecedented numbers, and the promises made by world leaders began to show cracks in the face of mounting challenges. Despite the progress made in resettling thousands of families and individuals, the systems in place were struggling to keep up. The task of integrating refugees into society was proving to be not just a matter of providing basic needs like food, shelter, and healthcare, but a much more profound transformation. Nations that had once been bastions of stability and wealth were now faced with the complex questions of cultural integration, economic strain, and social cohesion. In the United States, President Valerie Smith had been pushing for a bold economic strategy to support refugee resettlement, an ambitious initiative to include refugees as active contributors to the economy. She knew that welcoming refugees wasn't just about offering shelter, it was about providing opportunities for them to work, build businesses, and contribute to their new communities. But this vision faced significant opposition from sectors of the population that saw the increased refugee influx as an economic burden. On Capitol Hill, the debate grew more heated with each passing day. Some lawmakers voiced concerns that the sudden influx of refugees would place undue strain on the already fragile job market. Critics argued that refugees, particularly those with limited education and experience, would compete with Americans for scarce jobs, leading to higher unemployment and lower wages. In contrast, Smith and her supporters continued to argue that the refugees brought with them not just needs, but also potential. "It's an investment in our future," Smith said in a national address. "Refugees are people with untapped talents. They bring skills, drive, and a determination to rebuild their lives. The longer we delay providing them opportunities, the longer we delay reaping the benefits of their contributions." But the debate remained unresolved, and as the months wore on, some regions of the United States saw rising tensions. Economic inequalities were already fueling discontent, and the refugee crisis seemed to exacerbate these frustrations. In places like Detroit and rural areas in the Midwest, new arrivals to the community were sometimes met with hostility, as local populations felt threatened by the perceived economic competition. Perhaps the greatest challenge of all, however, was the cultural integration of refugees into their new communities. While many individuals and groups welcomed refugees with open arms, others saw the newcomers as an imposition on their way of life. In Europe, countries like Germany, Sweden, and France had been on the front lines of resettling refugees. These countries had historically embraced diversity, but the rapid pace of change was testing their limits. In Berlin, some neighborhoods had seen tensions flare between local populations and refugee communities. Despite the progress in some areas, cultural clashes were becoming increasingly apparent. For example, in a district known for its vibrant Turkish-German community, a newly arrived group of Syrian refugees was met with both curiosity and skepticism. Many of the refugees were from rural backgrounds and found it difficult to adapt to urban life in Germany. Language barriers, unfamiliar cultural norms, and differences in lifestyle made the process of assimilation a daily struggle. In one neighborhood, a group of young Syrian refugees found themselves drawn into clashes with local youth, fueled by misunderstandings and animosities on both sides. While the local German youth felt frustrated by the perceived threat to their way of life, the refugees, still grieving the loss of their homes, struggled with isolation and discrimination. "We're not here to take anything away," said Amir, a 22-year-old refugee from Syria. "We just want a chance to live, to rebuild our lives, like anyone else." But they don't see that. They see us as a problem. The refugee crisis had not only tested the ability of governments to absorb large numbers of newcomers but also strained the social fabric of the countries that had so generously opened their doors. While many had embraced the refugees, the reality of cultural integration was far more difficult than anticipated. One area where the stakes were especially high was education. For the children of refugees, the chance to attend school was not just about acquiring knowledge, it was about finding a sense of normalcy, purpose, and a chance to shape their futures. But the educational systems in host countries were not prepared for the rapid influx of children from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. In Germany, for example, teachers were faced with overcrowded classrooms and a lack of resources to teach students who didn't speak German. Many refugee children had missed years of formal schooling due to the chaos of war, and as a result, they were often several years behind their peers in terms of education. In the United States, the challenges were no less daunting. Refugee children in cities like Chicago and New York were often placed in schools that were already under-resourced and overcrowded. While some teachers made tremendous efforts to bridge the gaps, the demands on the system were overwhelming. Refugees were often placed in classes that lacked adequate support, and many of these children struggled to keep up, falling behind academically and socially. For young refugees like 12-year-old Fatima, who had fled Syria with her family, the classroom was a battleground of isolation. "It's hard to be in a place where no one understands you," she said, her eyes downcast. "I try to speak, but no one gets what I'm saying. I don't belong here." Fatima's experience was not unique. Across refugee communities, children were finding it difficult to adjust to their new environments, both academically and emotionally. Teachers and counselors worked tirelessly to help them integrate, but the lack of resources made it nearly impossible to provide each child with the individual attention they needed. Despite the growing challenges, there was a glimmer of hope, an opportunity for countries to work together to solve these issues. The United Nations, the European Union, and other international bodies convened a series of forums focused specifically on long-term refugee integration. These forums brought together governments, NGOs, and grassroots organizations to share best practices and identify areas where more support was needed. For example, Germany, Sweden, and Canada shared strategies on how they had implemented successful vocational training programs for refugees, while the United States focused on community-based initiatives that sought to bridge cultural divides. Countries that had struggled in the early stages of the crisis were beginning to recognize that integration was not a challenge that could be solved overnight. It required constant, sustained effort and a commitment to inclusivity. At the same time, grassroots organizations like Hannah's Hope continued to advocate for better education and employment opportunities for refugees. They argued that the real cost of inaction wasn't just the failure to support refugees, it was the loss of potential, the lost opportunities for the world to benefit from the skills and talents these individuals had to offer. The road ahead was long, but the sense of shared responsibility was beginning to take root. There was no denying the difficulties, but for the first time, the world was coming to understand that the refugee crisis was not a short-term issue. It was a generational challenge, one that would require a long-term commitment from all of humanity. As the world grappled with the immediate challenges of the refugee crisis, a new phase was beginning to take shape, a phase focused not just on survival, but on sustainable long-term solutions. The crisis had forced the global community to confront uncomfortable truths about inequality, the limits of national sovereignty, and the increasingly interconnected nature of the world. But now, as the dust settled from the initial rush of resettlements, it was clear that the way forward would require more than just a response to an emergency. The world had to ask itself, how would it address the root causes of displacement, and how could refugees be integrated into societies in ways that ensured their futures, and the futures of their host countries, were secure? For many of the world's leaders, the immediate response to the refugee crisis had been framed by urgency. Governments, international organizations, and non-profits had scrambled to provide food, shelter, and healthcare to millions of people on the move. Now, however, the world was transitioning from crisis management to long-term planning. But this shift was not without its own set of complications. In Washington, President Valerie Smith convened a summit of world leaders to address the long-term challenges posed by refugee integration. The summit, held in a state-of-the-art conference center, brought together leaders from Europe, North America, the Middle East, and Asia, as well as representatives from major humanitarian organizations. The question on everyone's mind was clear: what would the next steps look like? Smith opened the summit with a blunt statement: the refugee crisis is not over. We are only at the beginning of a much larger and more complex challenge. Our responsibility now is to ensure that the people we've welcomed into our societies can not only survive but thrive. The summit focused on several key themes: fostering economic opportunities for refugees, ensuring access to education, building stronger social safety nets, and addressing the root causes of displacement. While the discussions were earnest, it was clear that the solutions being proposed would not be easy. For many countries, the idea of permanently altering immigration policies, shifting public resources, and committing to multilateral action seemed daunting. The question that lingered over the summit was not just how to manage the crisis, but how to prevent future crises from unfolding. What could the international community do to address the factors that had driven millions of people to flee their homes in the first place: armed conflict, climate change, political instability, and economic inequality? The challenge of finding sustainable solutions to the refugee crisis would not be solved by resettling people alone. Experts and world leaders acknowledged that while resettlement was critical, it was not enough to address the systemic issues that caused so many people to leave their homes in the first place. As the summit unfolded, the focus shifted to addressing the root causes of displacement, starting with the international community's commitment to conflict resolution, poverty reduction, and climate action. In particular, the rise of climate-induced displacement was a growing concern. As natural disasters and extreme weather events intensified due to global warming, communities in regions like Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central America were becoming increasingly vulnerable to displacement. The United Nations, under the leadership of UNHCR, launched a new initiative aimed at addressing the intersection of climate change and displacement, calling on world leaders to recognize climate refugees as a specific category of migrants deserving of protection. Climate change is no longer a distant problem. It is happening now, said Antonio Guterres, Secretary-General of the United Nations, during his address at the summit. We must act now to protect those whose homes are disappearing, whose lands are being swallowed by the sea, and whose lives are being devastated by droughts and floods. If we don't, we will face even greater waves of migration in the future. The conversations around climate change and displacement were particularly poignant for those at the summit who had witnessed firsthand the impact of natural disasters. Small island nations, which had long been threatened by rising sea levels, pushed for stronger international action to mitigate the damage of climate change, arguing that they had already lost so much, and their populations were already being displaced. In parallel with these discussions about the root causes of displacement, there was a growing recognition that technology and innovation would play a critical role in the future of refugee integration. From education to healthcare, technology had the potential to bridge gaps and offer solutions that could transform the refugee experience. In refugee camps, digital platforms were being used to deliver education and skills training remotely, allowing children and adults alike to access lessons despite being cut off from traditional schooling. Some countries were also exploring the use of blockchain technology to manage refugee identification and aid distribution, making it easier for refugees to access services and ensuring that resources were allocated efficiently. Tech companies, like Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, were increasingly being called upon to leverage their expertise to help refugees. These companies had the resources and the talent to help build systems that could integrate refugees into their host countries in ways that would make the process more efficient, transparent, and empowering. We have an opportunity to rethink the way we approach this crisis, said Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, at the summit. It's not just about providing aid. It's about providing a future, and technology can help us deliver that future. In some cases, these innovations were already having an impact. In Jordan, for example, a program that connected Syrian refugee children with online teachers allowed thousands of children to continue their education while living in refugee camps. Similarly, in Kenya, a pilot program that provided vocational training to refugees through digital platforms had shown promising results, helping people learn skills that would eventually allow them to contribute to the local economy. The long-term success of refugee integration ultimately depended on global peace and stability. As the summit discussions unfolded, it became evident that the refugee crisis could not be solved without addressing the root causes of conflict. For many of the refugees who had fled war-torn countries like Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan, the future of their integration depended on the resolution of the very conflicts that had displaced them. President Valerie Smith and other leaders at the summit called for a renewed focus on diplomacy and conflict resolution. The international community, they argued, needed to redouble its efforts to resolve ongoing conflicts and prevent new ones from emerging. It was clear that until the root causes of displacement were addressed, the world would continue to face waves of migration. For countries like Syria, where civil war had displaced millions, the prospects of peace seemed distant, but not impossible. Leaders like Smith, Mueller, and Guterres agreed that while the path to peace would be difficult and slow, the first step was to create the conditions for a lasting ceasefire, followed by efforts to rebuild the country from the ground up. Humanitarian aid, alongside peace negotiations, was essential to stabilizing regions torn apart by violence. As the summit came to a close, world leaders left with a renewed sense of purpose and urgency. There was no quick fix for the refugee crisis, but there was a shared recognition that the world's response would determine the future of millions of people. The path forward would require unprecedented levels of cooperation, not just between governments, but also with civil society, tech innovators, and international organizations. While challenges remained, the summit represented a turning point. The world had made strides in addressing the immediate needs of refugees, but now, it was time to shift gears, toward long-term sustainability, shared responsibility, and a collective commitment to a future where no one was forced to flee their home due to violence, persecution, or disaster. The road ahead was daunting, but for the first time in history, the world seemed willing to walk it together. As the dust from the summit began to settle, the world seemed to hold its breath. A new era was unfolding, one marked not only by the refugee crisis but by a profound shift in global attitudes. The conversations and decisions that had taken place over the last year would shape the future of millions, if not billions, of lives. The world was at a crossroads, and its path forward would define not only how refugees were treated, but how the world responded to the deepening challenges of climate change, political instability, and the forces of migration. But as much as the summit had brought hope, it had also illuminated just how much work remained to be done. The policies discussed were ambitious, but there was no denying that action, not just dialogue, was what was truly needed. The question now was whether the momentum generated could translate into lasting change or if it would fizzle out as many previous efforts had. Back in the United States, President Valerie Smith knew that the hardest part was still ahead. In her heart, she believed that this was the defining issue of the generation, but even her optimism couldn't shield her from the political realities that loomed large. While much of the world was on board with the idea of long-term refugee resettlement, at home, she faced fierce opposition from the populist factions of her country's political establishment. In a pivotal address to Congress, Smith laid out her vision for the future, a comprehensive approach that combined economic opportunities for refugees with a concerted push to address the root causes of displacement. "We cannot go backward," Smith said, her voice steady. "What we are dealing with is not just an economic or humanitarian crisis, but a moral one. Our response will define us as a nation, and as a people." The address was met with mixed reactions. Some applauded her courage, while others attacked her for being too idealistic. But even her harshest critics could not deny that her administration had made significant strides in forging an international coalition to deal with the refugee crisis. The challenge now was turning those diplomatic gains into real-world results. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, European leaders were also grappling with the same questions. Would the integration of refugees spark a new wave of innovation and cultural exchange, or would it lead to increased social and political tension? The next few years would tell. The role of technology continued to be one of the most exciting aspects of the new global refugee response. By the end of 2025, initiatives like the Digital Refugee Network, which connected refugees with online learning and job opportunities, were becoming the cornerstone of the next phase of integration. In Germany, the government expanded its pilot vocational training programs, using digital platforms to provide specialized skills for refugees in fields like technology, healthcare, and engineering. These programs proved especially valuable for women and young adults who had previously been excluded from traditional job markets. In Sweden, local governments had partnered with private companies to establish refugee-run small businesses, with the aim of fostering entrepreneurship among young refugees. These businesses became vital parts of their communities, not only providing jobs for refugees but also contributing to the local economy. Refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq were opening up restaurants, tech startups, and small shops that catered to both refugee populations and local residents. And it wasn't just in Europe or North America where innovation was flourishing. In Lebanon, a country hosting a massive number of Syrian refugees, grassroots tech hubs were emerging, offering refugees a space to learn coding, graphic design, and other digital skills. Organizations like Tech for Refugees were teaching refugees how to build websites, develop apps, and even start their own tech companies, giving them a sense of ownership and empowerment that went beyond the limitations of aid. In all corners of the globe, it became clear that refugees had not only the ability to contribute, they were already doing so, often in ways that had a far-reaching impact. Through these innovative programs, they were proving that integration wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving, rebuilding, and creating new opportunities. But perhaps the most profound shift was cultural. The narrative around refugees was changing. As more refugees successfully integrated into society, learning languages, starting businesses, and contributing to their communities, the stigma that had once surrounded them began to dissipate. Refugees were no longer seen as a burden, but as a vital, contributing part of society. This change didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't easy. It took years of consistent effort from governments, nonprofits, and individuals who were determined to change the story. But as refugee entrepreneurs became household names, as refugee artists and musicians contributed to the cultural landscape, and as the children of refugees excelled in schools, the public perception slowly transformed. In the United States, a young Syrian refugee named Zainab became a household name after her tech company, founded with the help of a government-sponsored training program, reached a multi-million-dollar valuation. She was invited to speak at major tech conferences, not just as a success story, but as an example of how the global refugee crisis could be an opportunity for innovation. Similarly, in France, the band New Horizons, made up entirely of refugees from various conflict zones, won a prestigious music award for their fusion of traditional music from the Middle East and North Africa with Western pop. Their success was seen as a metaphor for the cultural fusion that was taking place in communities across Europe. Refugees were no longer outsiders, they were artists, entrepreneurs, and essential members of the society they had once been so distant from. By 2026, many countries had adjusted their immigration policies to better support refugee integration. The United States passed a groundbreaking refugee resettlement bill, which prioritized both short-term assistance and long-term integration. The bill introduced a system of refugee entrepreneurship visas, which provided refugees with the support they needed to start businesses, and also expanded access to public education and healthcare for all refugees. In the United Kingdom, a national framework for refugee integration was established, which emphasized not only job placement but also cultural exchange. In Australia, a new program was launched that aimed to support refugees in regional areas, spreading the population out and ensuring that all communities, no matter their size, had the resources to support newcomers. International organizations like the UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration also worked to build stronger, more resilient systems for refugees. They prioritized partnerships with local governments, civil society, and the private sector to create holistic solutions to refugee challenges. The idea was to take a whole-of-society approach, integrating refugees into every part of the social, cultural, and economic fabric of their new homes. As refugees around the world began to rebuild their lives, they carried with them a sense of hope that had been absent in the early years of the crisis. They were no longer waiting for help, they were now helping others, shaping new futures, and contributing to the global community in ways that many had never imagined. The success stories were numerous, but the journey was far from over. The next generation of refugees would face new challenges, as climate change continued to displace millions, and as political instability raged on in parts of the world. But as the world had learned through its efforts to integrate refugees, solutions were possible when countries worked together. In the end, the refugee crisis was not just a story of loss and survival, it was a story of resilience, renewal, and the hope for a better world. The lessons learned from the crisis would be carried forward, not as a scar on the global conscience, but as a testament to the power of human compassion and the ability to change. The world was not perfect. The road ahead would still be full of challenges. But as the refugee crisis began to recede, humanity had taken a collective step forward, a step that would leave an indelible mark on history. Thank you for joining us on this journey. The refugee crisis is far from over, but the world is changing. And with each new story of resilience, hope, and transformation, we move closer to a world where displacement is no longer the end, but the beginning of a new chapter for all of humanity. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?